Well, hello everyone, and welcome to another cigar stream. About 5 or 6 weeks ago, I did a little solo stream where I started to look at the Tories through history, and in that stream we dealt with the Robert Peel era, uh, during which one of the biggest things was the repeal of the Corn Laws. And today we're going to move a little bit forward in history and look at um, probably the most important Tory figure of the 19th century, which is Benjamin Disraeli, who had a very long career in Parliament, both as Prime Minister and as a minister before then. And I'm joined by AM for this stream.
Hi, absolutely wonderful to be here. Thank you for having me on.
Yes, and we will be doing a number of things. So I have this book by a lot of people were annoyed by the historian I used last time. I was still getting like messages of saying like, "Oh, this historian really annoyed me. He was too liberal," type thing. So I thought
Robert Blake. Yes, interestingly, he also wrote probably one of the most famous biographies in Disraeli. But of course, coming out of that post-Macmillan tradition, I do find it rather frustrating. I think one of the things we're probably talking about is the corruption of one nation Toryism, and I think very much Robert Blake represents that.
Yes, and so instead, I picked up another historian, a very well-known historian, A.J.P. Taylor, and he has a book called British Prime Ministers and Other Essays. This is good because his chapters are very short. They're only like 7 or 8 pages. I get the impression that this is a collection of things that he put, in magazines and things over the years. That's the impression I get. Taylor's a very clear writer. I mean, he's known for being a bit anti-German, let's just say.
You can say that, yeah.
Yeah, and he's a World War II historian. That's what he's known for more than anything. But this is kind of a useful collection for the facts that we can then put some of the flesh on the bones. But before we get into that, I also found this extraordinary film from 1931 that I thought we'd watch. Hopefully, BFI won't, get the stream taken down or anything like this, like Postman Pat did once. If that happens, we'll just have to start again,
Yeah.
But I'm hoping that they won't do that. And this is a film that was made in 1931. It's actually hosted by Stanley Baldwin, who was also the Prime Minister.
It's very surprising.
Which I'd never seen Stanley Baldwin before. This is one of the really interesting things about this film for me is that it's roughly equidistant between Disraeli and us.
Yeah.
And we've got these people from the 1930s acting as a kind of bridge between like the Victorians and us, and there's something about that I kind of gave me it's just a really interesting thing, isn't it, to rely on the people of this era to give us a flavor of what Disraeli was like. So
I'm amazed such a thing exists, especially with the introduction.
Yeah. So we're gonna watch this and analyze it in real time. There's a famous actor of the period called George Arliss who plays Disraeli, and it's kind of interesting because this George Arliss has got quite a following in his own right, and the comments are full of kind of equal parts Disraeli fans and Arliss fans, which is a little bit curious. But before I get there, I'll just read you Taylor's kind of bullet points summary right at the top, okay?
Yeah.
It just says, Benjamin Disraeli, 1804 to 1881. Son of a Jewish man of letters, mainly self-educated, himself the author of frivolous romantic novels, which can still be read today with pleasure, began politically as a radical and never became wholly respectable. MP from 1837 to 76. Led the attack on Peel over the repeal of the Corn Laws in 1846. Although, as we'll see later on, he didn't actually repeal the repeal when he actually took office. Later, we can talk about that.
Yeah.
He led the Conservative opposition in the House of Commons from 1849 onwards. He was the Chancellor of the Exchequer in Conservative minority governments in 1852, 1858 to 59, and 1866 to 68. He carried household suffrage in 1867. He became Prime Minister in 1868, and then from 1874 to 1880. He made Queen Victoria the Empress of India. She made him the Earl of Beaconsfield in 1876. He brought back peace with honor. Brought back peace with honor in 1878. And as we'll see, Disraeli, a fan of the empire, defender of the empire, as we'll see, a rather unusual figure. In fact, I might as well read before we watch this little film, I'll just read the very first passage that Taylor writes of him as well, because it's a kind of interesting one. He says,
Yeah.
"You may know the story of the man who saw a giraffe and said, 'There ain't no such animal.' This, I think, is the only adequate comment that one can make about Benjamin Disraeli at the end of his life, the Earl of Beaconsfield. There are perhaps important general things in Disraeli's career, which indeed I have tried to discover, but the most remarkable thing about Disraeli is Disraeli himself. The way in which he refuses to fit into any of the patterns of the age, or indeed of any age. He was for much of his life the leader of the Conservative Party, the party which was called the Party of Gentlemen of England. His colleagues in the cabinet were all great landowners. He himself moved, so far as he moved in society at all, in the society of aristocrats." So, I just thought that was. Do you think it's fair to say he's kind of a unique figure in this period and in history in general?
Absolutely, I do think he's a unique figure. I think what sets apart Disraeli from many of his contemporaries is, of course, his peculiar upbringing, and also his particular strand of political conservatism. One of the things I find most interesting about him from a historiographical point of view, and this is elucidated in Sybil and Coningsby, his novels, and I take objection to A.J.P. Taylor's assertion that they're frivolous romantic novels. I think if you're going to understand Disraeli, actually reading the novels are very helpful, because they're basically what you call a romanatesse. They are thesis novels. Disraeli essentially believed that the novel was the perfect formula with which to make certain political statements and do it in a popular way. When it comes to, in particular, Sybil and Coningsby, I would say, rather than inheriting the more sort of, Whigified conservative tradition which he inherited, he actually is a reactionary from a historical point of view. You see him riling consistently against Whigs. And of course, the main historian at the time, Macaulay, is, one of the originators of the great originators of Whig history, along with Gibbon. You see this sympathy going back all the way to 1688 with the deposition of James II. And he actually calls the Glorious Revolution the conquest of Britain by Dutch finance, which I find, again, fascinating, completely turning the Whig mythology of England, which had been pervasive for 150 years at that point, on its head. And he used it to attack materialism, among other things. And very much my belief, I don't believe he's a radical in his early age. Rather, I think he's inspired by one of your favorite writers, Thomas Carlyle. He wrote Sybil on the back of Thomas Carlyle having published Chartism in 1939 and Past and Present, I think, in 1942. And if you read Sybil in particular, you very much see these ideas coming across. You've been doing a recent series on libertarianism versus conservatism. And something that comes across very much is that he also believes that the condition of the working man, the peasant, in the Middle Ages and the early modern era was better than that of the 19th century. And he also points to some sort of, again, fascinating nostalgia for pre-Reformation England and the abbey and the cathedral, the monastery as a hub of life, for its own sake, rather than serving the interests of the state. And he uses this as a tangent to attack, among others, Thomas Cromwell. So I think there's a fascinating sort of trend of reactionary thought in Disraeli, which really sets him apart from, as you mentioned, Sir Robert Peel. I would say Sir Robert Peel is really the originator of betrayal in modern conservatism, so much so that the Liberal Party would in many ways be descendants of that movement within the Conservatives, which would become the Peelites.
Yeah, no, I mean, as we'll see when we watch this film, I mean, you cannot say Disraeli many of his views are particularly liberal, as we'll get on to. With some caveats. I mean, I think it's fair to say that even if Disraeli was a fan of Carlyle was not a fan of Disraeli.
Oh yeah, that's definitely true.
We'll just put it that way. But then again, Carlyle wasn't a fan of many people. So
no. Well, I think just to sort of expand upon that point. The connection between Carlyle and Disraeli, the direct personal connection, was through Baron Rothschild. I think it's better to refer to him as Freiherr Rothschild, because the Baron's position was an Austrian title and not a British title, which he came over along with the Frankfurt branch of the family under his father Nathan. Carlyle had been invited into Parliament in 1848 to basically campaign for the enfranchisement of the Jews, and Carlyle, of course, refused to do any such thing. But when it came to Disraeli, on the other hand, Disraeli was a friend of Baron Rothschild.
Yes, and he, I mean, we'll get into some of that, but he lobbied on behalf of. I mean, you were explaining this before we got on stream. It wasn't that Jews couldn't be elected; it's that they couldn't actually take up office.
Yeah.
Until there was some bit of legislation change, which Disraeli helped to do.
Yes, right? The central thing about this is the oath that you swear in at the beginning of a parliamentary session. And before the Catholic emancipation, essentially the oath was to the Christian church, and by that the Anglican church, and to the monarch. And what we see throughout the 19th century is that we see the expansion of what is permitted under the oath. With Catholic emancipation, of course, it's allowing Catholics to take the oath and not swear allegiance to the Anglican Church. With the Jewish Relief Act of 1858, which is helped pass by Disraeli and the Whigs, which is going to be a consistent theme we're going to run into, Lionel Rothschild is able to take his seat in Parliament as a Whig, swearing under Jehovah as opposed to the Christian religion. And of course, this ends up with 1888, with Charles Bradlaugh being able to be sworn into Parliament as an atheist. So again, I think this is an interesting thing. We see this. One could say, on the other hand, it's a more inclusive Britain, but on the other hand, one can say that one is breaking the fundamental unity of Britain by doing this. Because again, swearing an oath before the monarch under the state religion, again, could be seen as one of the most intrinsic acts in order to declare allegiance to the country and whatever principles that country stands for.
Yeah, and the one other thing I'll say is that certainly some people who did read Disraeli's novels, for example, there's a chapter on Disraeli in a book by the car manufacturer, and he quotes extensively from this Coningsby that you're talking about, because it has a Jewish character in it, and who has interesting things to say. Let's just say,
and there's rumor, of course, that character you're referring to is a character of either Rothschild or Disraeli himself, which is a consistent theme among Disraeli's novels, that he finds a character to insert himself into, including a character called Beaconsfield.
Yeah, there is also a quotation that is brought up quite a lot, but I can't find a source for it. I don't know if you've been able to. And it's Disraeli on race. Disraeli was purported to have said, "No man will treat with indifference the principle of race. It is the key to history, and why history is so confused is that it has been written by men who were ignorant of this principle and all the knowledge it involves. Language and religion do not make a race. There is only one thing that makes a race, and that is blood. Apparently, Disraeli said that, but I can't actually find where he said it.
Well, I'm not sure about the precise provenance of that quote, but I think it very much substantiates his own way of thinking. I mean, in terms of, again, we're going to talk about, Carlyle as influencing Disraeli. Carlyle, of course, has this concept of the two nations, and again, this idea of, one could almost say, neo-feudalism or noblesse oblige, the idea that the nobility essentially has to be a moral nobility. It has to be a nobility committed to the condition of the working classes under its care, and I think this is a theme very consistent with Disraeli in terms of he has to establish his own aristocratic credentials in order to justify himself as part of this aristocratic tradition in the vein of someone like a Carlyle or more reactionary view. So, of course, he can't claim a English aristocracy, and I think he attains it eventually in 1876 when Queen Victoria creates him Earl Beaconsfield. But before then, and again, this is part of his, again, you can detect in his books, he creates for his father in particular, Isaac Disraeli, a grand genealogy dating back to grandees in the Republic of Venice. But in terms of his actual upbringing, his actual ancestry, we know he's related from Sephardic Jews, so Jews who operated around Toledo when Spain was Andalusia, i.e. under the rule of the Muslims. There's even some spurious connection that he was related to a great 11th century philosopher called Isaac Suleiman Israeli from Tunisia. So interesting things. And again, on his mother's side, he was connected to the Rothschilds. But in terms of his own sort of conception of aristocracy, he entered Parliament in 1836, in purple waistcoats, wearing sort of golden chains and, emerald rings, and professing to be some sort of Tory grandee, which is, absolutely patently absurd. But I do believe that within his own conception of Jewishness, I mean, there's this quote. It's not necessarily confirmed, but there was apparently a debate between him and Daniel O'Connell, one of the protagonists in Irish Catholic history, where O'Connell supposedly attacked him for his Jewishness. And Disraeli responded saying, whilst your ancestors were living as savages in a land of little note, i.e. Ireland, my ancestors were the high priests in the Temple of Solomon. So he very much considered that his Jewish ancestry gave him some sort of aristocratic lineage in which he effectively thought himself he could be ingratiated within the English aristocracy.
Apparently, that quotation is attributed to the novel Endymion, which I haven't read.
Endymion. I haven't read Endymion. Sorry to say.
But having, I mean, just having a quick kind of control F of it, I can't find it still. So it's still unconfirmed as to whether he actually said it. I mean, just in the interests of accuracy here. But it's reproduced a lot. That particular quotation, you'll find it all over the internet. But it's another one of those maybe like phantom quotes. I mean, some people are even giving like page references, page 249 of that novel, but I can't find it in the version that's on archive.org. So anyway, that's something for you to follow up. But let us have a look at this bit of footage now. And when you want to make a point, AM, just say, pause, and I'll pause it, and we'll talk. Yep. I'll turn it up a bit. There is no sound in this bit, by the way. I was just.
I have been asked to say a few words by way of introduction.
This is a man who you can tell is not used to being on camera. not a modern politician.
I don't know. I thought he actually does it quite well, but I don't know.
Yeah, I had some, but what I'm saying is that he kind of comes across as if he's just kind of reading these notes. He's been pushed them. Well, let's have a look.
The film which you are about to witness. The object of this film is to give you a brief but vivid impression of the great conservative statesman of the last century, Benjamin Disraeli, Earl of Beaconsfield. And we have been extremely fortunate in securing for the purpose of presentation the services of that most distinguished actor, Mr. George Arliss, who is...
Do you know anything about George Arliss? I've not really come across him, but it seems that the viewers of this video on YouTube are big fans. So
no, I'm sorry, I know. No, I've never heard of George Arliss before. I think probably just to add a bit of context on Stanley Baldwin. Again, one of the things I find most bizarre about this video, of course, Stanley Baldwin was really the titan of interwar politics. I mean, he was effectively continuously prime minister or running the country from 1923 until 1937. Just for a little bit of historical context.
Then I'll probably return to Baldwin, in this little mini series. We'll have a look at. He's not talked about a lot at all, is he?
I find that fascinating, really, because he's the Conservative Prime Minister, which really has the first sort of serious interaction with Labour and Ramsay MacDonald. And the two were almost like a double act during the interwar period. He steps away as Prime Minister in 1924 to allow MacDonald to form a doomed minority government. And then he basically runs the country under a national coalition with Ramsay MacDonald as Prime Minister, which, was really quite bizarre looking back on it.
Is so well known in connection with that famous play of Disraeli. Now, in the course of this film, I think you will all of you be very much struck by those remarkable qualities of Disraeli, his rhetoric, his force of expression, and his vision. You will hear him in the first scene, which you will see, speak about the privileges we enjoy as having been born in these islands. You will then hear him speak about the empire. You will hear him speak about the principles of conservatism. And you will hear him discuss fiscal matters. And in all these things, I think you will be astonished in this, that of all the statesmen of his period, the time of our grandfathers, he is perhaps the only one who can be read today and appreciated as though he was a modern speaking in the times of today. The explanation of that is the remarkable vision and sympathy of the man. And I ask you to remember these things when you watch the representation.
There he is.
Mm-hmm.
The basis of English society is equality. But here let us distinguish. There are two kinds of equality. There is the equality that levels and destroys, and the equality that elevates and creates. It is this last quality that animates the laws of England. The principle of the first equality is that no one should be privileged. The principle of English equality is that everyone should be privileged.
Pause.
Yep.
Again, I think this is a fundamentally important point that Disraeli is never advocating for some sort of leveling effect. And I think, what's also important to note at this time, there is a strand, I think, in conservative economic thinking in particular, that could be read as progressivism. And, Frederick Engels was also writing at the same time as Disraeli, and I think in the same year as Sybil was published. Disraeli does believe there is a certain nobility associated with no matter what class you come from. So very much, in terms of his writing of the lower class, they're always determined to elevate their certain ancestry by, referring to the longbowmen who fought at the Battle of Agincourt. In regard to the nobility, again, it's and drawing back on this ancient ancestry, but more so, I think it's that Disraeli recognizes there is a dignity in each class, and that even though he definitely supports the idea of class distinction, he believes definitely in the separation of class distinction. And I think this is very important in the times, because this basically turns the more Whiggish conception on its head. Whiggism is definitely not against the classes, but I think Starkey talks about this, even though I think Starkey actually, especially with his comparing Disraeli to Boris Johnson, does Disraeli disservice. Believes it's the conservatism is the upper classes and the lower classes against the middle classes. And, this is something very consistent in Disraeli's thought against liberalism, that he essentially wants to not necessarily disenfranchise, but very much disempower the liberals and their bourgeoisie monopoly on power.
Yeah, no, it's funny you mentioned Boris Johnson, because when I was watching this before the stream, I did hear echoes in this, or maybe Boris lifted it from Disraeli.
Oh, I think very much so, yeah.
The idea of leveling up.
Yeah.
We're going to level up Britain, or whatever. What was the nonsensy slogan from last?
Well, the thing is, I don't want to sort of give him any credit, really. I'm more inclined to think that's just a game reference rather than the Disraeli reference. But I think in terms of, I do see, sadly, some imitation with Boris and Disraeli, especially Boris referring to himself as a one-man melting pot. I think very much in that he's trying to represent, again, I hate using this term, but the diversity of the heritage of Disraeli.
The meanest subject of our king is born to great and important privileges. An Englishman, however humble may be his birth, is born to the noblest of all inheritances, the equality of civil rights. He is born to freedom. He is born to justice. He is born to property. There is no station to which he may not aspire. There is no master whom he is obliged to serve. There is no magistrate who dares imprison him against the law. And the soil on which he labors must supply him with an honest and decorous maintenance.
Sounding
a little bit American dreamy, though, to me.
Yes, I do definitely feel that as well. I think, it's also important to understand that, why is Disraeli so interesting? Beforehand, we have this alliance with the Tories and the monarchy, essentially, and that's where Toryism really is created. And the reason why Disraeli is so significant is because Disraeli is trying to, for the first time in British history, wed this idea of mass politics and traditional forms, essentially, of conservative aristocratic politics. And I think one of the tragedies about Disraeli is that while he himself espoused very much a paternalistic aristocratic form of government, he was buying in also to the logic of democracy. And so, again, and also an interesting thing to point that he was writing this in opposition to liberalism and libertarianism, classical liberal economics, Adam Smith, laissez-faire, espoused by his chief rival Gladstone, who we haven't really talked about. And I think one of the fatal notions of this idea, which he's basically espousing, of one nation Toryism, and why one nation Toryism, he does mean an alliance between the nation of the rich and the nation of the poor, as he elucidates in Sybil, is that it works very well, I think, against libertarianism and classical liberalism. But when socialism comes to the floor, the Conservatives can't really offer any sort of alternative economic vision. against the socialists, because it's basically founded against classical liberalism. It's not founded against socialism. I mean, there have been attempts from various conservatives to find, a third way economic system, whether that, from the Catholic point of view, that be distributism under, Hilaire Belloc, or, the social encyclicals of Leo XIII or G.K. Chesterton, or, the more sort of nationalist economics of the mid-century Germans known as autarky. But I think, yes, there is a corrupting element within what Disraeli is saying, that whilst, there is this defense of aristocracy, there is also this idea that this idea of one nation Toryism can be corrupted, and it can be diluted successively over generations, to the point where we have it now, where Boris Johnson and Theresa May, and even to some extent, David Cameron, were all espousing one nation Toryism, despite the fact that there is no aristocracy, there is no nobility, there is no noblesse oblige. Any sort of claim on their part to be genuine elites in the sense that Disraeli was espousing is completely ridiculous, and he wouldn't recognize it as such.
Hug a hoodie. That's what David Cameron said famously.
Yeah.
I mean, the point you made about Carlyle's influence on Disraeli, I mean, clearly that would be a point of departure between those two, because Disraeli was the man who, emancipate. He brought in
yes, absolutely,
the first version of wasn't universal suffrage, but
it wasn't.
He expanded the franchise, and
Carlyle was anti-democratic. Yeah.
Carlyle obviously was against that. Yeah.
Do you want me to sort of expand upon this point a bit more? Because I think it is bears mentioning. When Carlyle was writing, of course, Chartism, 1839. The problem with Disraeli again is that, why isn't Disraeli a great man? Well, because Disraeli was trying to find an avenue for conservative politics within the framework of a constitution that was hostile to him, which is the Whig Constitution, 1688. And with the Great Reform Act of 1832, and just to explain what essentially the Great Reform Act did, it tried essentially to remove rotten boroughs, whereby you would have two electors, and usually it was the aristocracy or the landlord who would control the election in that rotten borough. It also enfranchised certain industrial cities in the north, in Lancashire, Manchester, etc., and Birmingham, which barely had any parliamentary representation. But the effect of this was, between 1832 and 1867, you essentially had a inbuilt liberal majority. Of, say, 60% of the electorate voting Liberal, 40% voting Conservative. And the only way the Conservatives actually had any hope of ever coming to power during that time was due to the Liberals' own, factionalism. There's this constant feud within liberalism at this time between the Peelites, the classical liberals, and the radical liberals. And of course, the other thing that favors the Conservatives is that so many of the seats are unopposed. But really, during this time, we don't actually have a single majority Conservative government, with the exception of Robert Peel. Robert Peel, whose government wasn't really Conservative at all. It betrayed conservatism. And this is where we have the birth of the political career of Disraeli, is in opposition to that, in defense of the Corn Laws, in defense again of the aristocratic privilege against this. So I think it's important to note that when Disraeli was thinking, he was very much thinking, the entire system is working against us. How are we going to make the situation more beneficial towards us? And what can he do? He can't rely on Queen Victoria. Queen Victoria, especially after Albert, was one of the most unpopular monarchs in British history, which people seem to forget. Republicanism was incredibly high in the 1860s and 1870s, but nevertheless, he does try and reinvigorate some sort of connection between the Conservative Party and Queen Victoria. I mean, his famous quote, everyone enjoys flattery, and when it comes to royalty, lay it on with a trowel. He very much wanted to ingratiate Queen Victoria with himself, with the party, and again, to reinforce this idea of the traditional institutions of state. However, at the same time, that wasn't enough, because England had moved beyond that point to become a parliamentary system. So what does one do? One has to look to another political constituency. And in his writings, it's very clear that he believed that political constituency were the people who would otherwise have been Chartists or socialists, which are the urban working classes, essentially, the borough working classes, but still, property owning to some extent, who were given the franchise under Disraeli as the head of the Commons, although he wasn't Prime Minister at that point in 1867. even though he's not really able to capitalize on those gains until 1874. And I think there is actually something to be said about this. I mean, I mentioned before the friction between liberalism and conservatism that actually helped conservative thought, even though it was corrupted by socialism. What's also important to note that Gladstone, for all his titanic historical reputation, did serious damage to the Liberal Party. Even though he won the 1868 election in a landslide, and he won the 1880 election, the effect of the 1867 Reform Act and Gladstone's own Reform Act of 1884 was that the Conservatives basically became the natural party of government because, as Disraeli predicted, they were much more predictable in voting conservatism, because Disraeli was able to combine this attitude towards the amelioration of the working man in the cities. And he does this through a load of legislation between 1874 and 1876. And of course, he appeals to the empire, he appeals to nationalism. And is that combination which is able to successfully win elections until 1906.
Yeah, I mean, I should mention as well, because most of these speeches are from around that period, aren't they? 1870s, I think one of them's even from later on, like 1880 even. One of the things that really did the Liberals in, and I know this from having covered the classical Liberals and some of the mistakes Gladstone made, is that because the Liberals were impossibly middle class, as they've always been, they, as the middle class tend to do, started to get impossibly moralistic, and they wanted to bring in the License Act, I seem to recall, in was it 1872, 1873, something like that. They brought in this License Act, which was going to close the pubs early, and this, and I know it sounds like a tiny issue, but this pissed off a lot of the working class. And it galvanized support for Disraeli for that 1874 election.
So, I mean, so much so that you mentioned that, so much so he even came second place in his own constituency in Greenwich. The only thing that saved him was the fact that England still had two-member constituencies at that point. I think, just a quick summary of Gladstone. I mean, we talk about Disraeli being a radical. My view is that Disraeli actually never changed his political position. I think he was very constant. If you look at him less as a progressive and more as a reactionary. But when it comes to Gladstone, I mean, he enters his political career in 1833, advocating against the abolition of slavery. And of course, slavery in the colonies was still around during this time, even though the transatlantic slave trade had been abolished. In 1838, and again, when I was researching this, found this out, he even advocated that nonconformists and Catholics should be forever banned from holding any civil offices. And of course, talk about a complete about turn. This is the man who would later he would successfully disestablish the church in Ireland, and he would try and disestablish the church in Church of Wales and Scotland. So no one has sort of done more damage historically to the Church of England than the same man who was basically advocating that any difference of opinion outside the Church of England would be banned by law. And of course, he splits from the Conservatives. He joins Peel, and he becomes the leading light in the Liberal Party.
Yeah, one of the, we'll carry on with this video in a second, but one of the things I recall from Thomas Sowell's Conflict of Visions, there's that old saying about, leftists see, the right see the left as kind of muddle-headed or mistaken in some way, whereas the left see the right as evil fundamentally. Sowell picks out a lot of choice quotes using Gladstone and Disraeli as his examples, where Gladstone seemed to think that Disraeli was an awful man, constantly calling him evil and so on, whereas Disraeli was always much more tempered and moderate, returning the fire type thing.
Yeah, well, I think, Disraeli obviously thought that Gladstone was mad, but I think there is a certain element to Gladstone that was mad. I mean, you have these incredible sort of moments of inner conversion where he would completely do a U-turn on a previous position he held, such as expanding the franchise. And of course, I think it's important to note that, other liberals at the time, such as his own Chancellor of the Exchequer, Robert Lowe, were very much against the expansion of the franchise, because they essentially believed that one had to become propertied. It was a privilege to aspire to rather than a right to be had. And Gladstone, of course, having opposed it, then became one of its, foremost proponents. The same thing happened with Irish Home Rule. He vigorously opposed it and then became a passionate supporter of it. So, and everything that Gladstone did was couched in this sort of messianic mission. Of course, the wonderful irony of it, the fact he changed his mind so many times.
Yeah. So let's carry on with this Disraeli speech. I think that's some good context and flavour to bear in mind as we watch this.
These are rights and privileges as valuable as king, lords, and commons. And it is only a nation thus schooled and cradled in the principles and practice of freedom which indeed could maintain such institutions.
You are now going to hear.
So, I mean, I just want to touch on what he was talking about there, which is he's got this idea that Britain is really about its institutions and about freedom. And in a way, that's making the country a set of ideas, almost in the American mold. It's not exactly the blood on the soil, is it?
Well, I think, again, I would argue that this conception of free England is, again, a very ancient conception. It goes back to the Anglo-Saxon times. It goes back before the conquest. I think, in terms of, again, the reactionary, there is this idea that the Englishman is always free, and this is, represented in the various coronation oaths we have, dating back all the way since Henry I and Magna Carta. So, what type of freedom is it? Is it obviously freedom in the Rousseauian sense? No, it isn't. I think it's very much trying to I don't know. It's sort of trying to reclaim the idea of liberty as something that exclusively the liberals have. But in terms, again, this is something of a problem with conservatism. These terms are ambiguous. I think within Disraeli's own conception, they are ambiguous as well, even though, there is propagandistic elements to it and there are historical allusions you can draw from it. I don't think there is some sort of clear underlying strategy behind it. And I think, it's just this, Cthulhu always swims leftwards. It's like, these words could be interpreted to mean expansion of this and that. And eventually we get to the point where the Conservatives are basically just parroting Blairism.
Yeah. I mean, you do have the conception of what they call the ancient freedom, right?
Yeah.
Which runs all the way through Shakespeare's plays, for example.
Yeah.
They're always going on about the ancient freedom. But anyway, let's carry on.
A passage from a speech made by Disraeli at the Crystal Palace in 1800.
Just saying, I think the Crystal Palace looks quite nice.
Yeah, it's a shame it got destroyed. I can't remember what year it is now. I have to look that up.
Wonder if Dee likes the Crystal Palace. He either thinks it's great or ghastly. No in between, I reckon. Let's carry on.
172. One of the most famous of all Disraeli's speeches.
And the Tory party has three great objects. The first is to maintain the institutions of the country.
See, what happens if the institutions oppose Disraeli?
Yeah, that's something also, I mean, that occurs to me as well. I mean, this is, of course, later Disraeli, but in earlier Disraeli, especially, again, I'm talking about his conception of history, he very much situates Edmund Burke within the Whig version of history. He tries to distance himself from the Tory history. And that's the issue with the conception of conservatism from institutions, is that, defending the institutions at all costs ultimately means when you have a strategy where they are subverted from within, as we've no doubt seen, then there's basically no defense against it.
What would it mean to defend the BBC today?
Yes, exactly.
It's basically a temple to your opponents. So
yeah, same with the NHS. Yeah.
Not from any sentiment of political superstition, but because we believe they embody the principles upon which a community like England can alone safely rest. principles of liberty, of order, of law, and of religion ought not to be entrusted to individual opinion or to the caprice and passion of multitudes, but should be embodied in a form of permanence and power.
The permanent civil service. I mean, do you see the issue with this?
Yes, well, I think trying to take the devil's advocate position, one can advocate a conception of the state that is, as opposed to one that is inherited and one that we would intend to give to our children as is. One that isn't constantly progressing towards some sort of utopian vision as the left does. However, I do sort of see that within the vein of some sort of pragmatic conception of order. And, Disraeli isn't, unique in this. Of course, Queen Elizabeth elucidated the same point, where she didn't want to, she wanted to establish order within the church, and she didn't want to open windows into men's souls. So I think there are lots of ways you can argue for this, but I think very much the point you're getting at is that these ideas have been corrupted, and conservatism has become completely anathema to any sort of sense of preservation. Really, it becomes the worship of power and the party essentially of natural power, but that power doesn't have any principles. On the one hand he espouses principles, on the other hand he espouses power, and I think with the Conservatives they're constantly shifting.
I will say, though, for the purposes of the physiognomy, honest mouth and chin, I would say. Honest forehead. Let's carry on.
The second great object is, in my opinion, to uphold the empire of England. And the third is to elevate the condition of the people. Let us see, in this great struggle between Toryism and liberalism that has prevailed in this country for the past 40 years, what are the salient features? It must be obvious to all who consider the condition of the people with a desire to elevate and improve it, that no important step can be reached unless you can effect a reduction of the hours of labor and humanize their toil.
Now, I will say that in all of my many books of dry, dusty economic data, they did work extremely long hours in the 19th century.
Yeah.
Even historically speaking. When I did that 1381 John Smith comparison, the daily hours of the medieval era versus this era are insane. I mean, they not only worked longer in the day, they also worked more days a year, even taking into account the fact that the medieval peasant would split their time between working for their lord and working for themselves.
Yep.
Even if you take that into account, they still work longer hours in the 19th century. So
yeah, I do think there is definitely a humanitarian argument to be made, and I think again it speaks in many ways to the genius of Disraeli, but also the tragedy of him, that he's able to again find a constituency which will be likely to vote for him, which aren't just the liberals, and he's able essentially to take away the moral monopoly from the business owner, from the factory owner, who'll be more likely to vote for the Liberal Party, and appeal directly underneath them for some sort of aristocratic paternalistic form of government. And within his own writings, again, infanticide is something he has a particular emphasis on, in addition to child labor. And we're writing at the same time also as Charles Dickens, the great novels of the 1840s. I think this is something that definitely concerns him. However, of course, the issue is that this could be interpreted as socialism. But in terms of the actual legislation he puts forward, it's called permissive legislation, whereby it's not state-imposed welfare. Rather, it is allowing and empowering the local councils of that time to essentially improve the conditions of factories, improve the conditions of things such as air, and reduce working hours, etc. It's very much a localized form of power, which Disraeli is focusing on, not this sort of unitary socialist vision.
Let's carry on. And yeah, I mean, we did explain at the top of the stream for latecomers, this is not actually Disraeli, it's the actor George.
But the great problem is to be able to achieve these results without violating those principles of economic truth upon which the prosperity of all states depends.
Yeah, so I mean, he's trying to strike a balance between laissez-faire economics and long working hours and health and safety standards and things like that.
Yeah, and I think it's important to note that Disraeli was sort of Chancellor of the Exchequer for a brief stint in 1852, but he was famously appalling at it. I think one of the things that differentiates him and Gladstone is very much that Gladstone is the better of the two in terms of his balancing of the budget and in terms of his taxation policies, but also in terms of his campaign for certain deregulation during that time, as you're probably no doubt very well aware. And again, I think Disraeli, when he comes into power, this is in 1872, he comes into power in 1874, and he very much leaves these matters to his underlings, whilst he again is focusing on the big picture politics.
The Tory party, unless it is a national party, is nothing. It is not a confederacy of nobles. It is not a democratic multitude. It is a party formed from all the numerous classes of the realm, classes alike unequal before the law, but with different conditions and different aims, which give vigor and variety to our national life.
What do you think about this division? Because, I mean, I can't imagine De Maistre being up for this. I mean, what do you think of this idea that each of these different classes have got their own traditions, their own identity, and their own, aims and goals, but the combination of those things are the thing that give the country vigor? It's kind of like, it's a variation of diversity is our strength, but kind of
true diversity as opposed to whatever it is we have now. We're just trying to bring in De Maistre. De Maistre did believe in a conception of like an expanded council, all the estates aiding in the help of the king. So really one could interpret this from the reactionary point of view, that this is the third estate, the second estate being the nobility, and the first estate being the clergy, all combining together with the monarch again, even though at this time the monarch, Queen Victoria, is completely politically inert. So the power of government in this country has in fact transferred to what Disraeli would consider an aristocratic elite, and he himself would become an aristocrat in 1876. And, a lot of people have sort of argued that this is Tory democracy. And as he pointed out there, it is not government of the multitude. It is government rather on behalf of the multitude. I think this is important to note. And it is definitely not, trying to find a middle ground between them. It's very much trying to understand and stress the difference between class. And therefore, I do think there's something reactionary in it. But I think, again, he's using this within a political framework which tends towards greater emancipation and greater socialization.
Yeah, I mean, even in someone like Evola, like a capital T traditionalist, he does say that like a good peasant, like somebody who's a good, honest, hardworking turnip farmer is better than like a really bad king, if you want to put it that way, because he's doing his role.
Yes, exactly.
So they have that constant. That's a constant theme in a lot of reactionary literature. That there is. I mean, it's not egalitarian. It's not equality in an egalitarian sense, but it is in the sense that everybody, regardless of their rank in society, has their role to play. Something like this.
It's some sort of, I guess, appeal to nobility. And again, he is again, I think, alluding to alleviating the economic condition, and one could interpret a little hint of line go up, but I think there is also this assertion again, of Carlyle's thinking, which one has to initiate some sort of moral or ideological reinvention of the concept of the estates, and I think this is what he was going for, even though it was unsuccessful in the long term.
Yeah. Well, if somebody's asking in the chat, is a good truck better than a bad tank engine? I mean, that's a very difficult one. No is the answer, because a truck is not able to attain even the basic dignity that Disraeli and the other reactionaries are talking about here. All right, let's carry on. Okay, so there we are.
You are now going.
Yes,
This also repeats, so
yeah.
just skip this bit.
There's a weird bit here where they play the same speech again for some reason. Just an editing error, I think.
National life.
A representation of Disraeli addressing the upper house on the subject of the British Empire at the House of Lords in 1878.
I have ever considered that Her Majesty's government, of whatever party formed, are the trustees of the empire. That empire was formed by the enterprise and energy of your ancestors, my lords, and it is one of a very peculiar character. I know no example of it, either in ancient or modern history. No Caesar or Charlemagne ever presided over a dominion so peculiar.
Get out, Charlemagne.
Its flag floats on many waters. It has provinces in every zone. They are inhabited by persons of different races, different religion, different laws, manners, customs. Some of these are bound to us by ties of liberty, fully conscious that without their connection with the metropolis, they have no security for public freedom and self-government. Others are bound to us by flesh and blood and by material as well as moral considerations.
Pause. I think, him talking about the connection to the metropolis. This also echoes with another famous quote from Disraeli, whereby if the cottage is unhappy, then the castle cannot be at peace, or something equivalent to that. I think very much his conception of empire is, again, not just alleviating the condition of England itself, but of the empire itself. And I think, Disraeli, more so than really any other politician in the 19th century, including another great prime minister, which is, barely ever talked about, Lord Palmerston, had a real vision. For empire. When he comes in briefly to power with Edward Stanley, the Earl of Derby, in 1958, he is the one advocating for the essentially the nationalization of India, because before then, India had not belonged to the crown. India had been basically ruled by the private company, the East India Company. And he believed that making it a crown possession, again, would give it all of these rights and give it a certain security and help alleviate its conditions. So basically, he was saying this on the back of the 1858 mutiny.
Yeah.
Lords, that empire is no mean heritage. That it is not a heritage that can only be enjoyed.
Can I just say, I don't know what they're, don't know what they were thinking here. I reckon this guy in the back here is like a liberal, because he's very upset with this speech. If you watch him as it goes on,
I'll keep an eye on him as we go along.
I love a background minion, as some people know. So
it must be maintained, and it can only be maintained by the same qualities that created it: by courage, by discipline, by patience, by determination, and by a reverence for public law and a respect for national rights.
And again, pause, sorry. Again, sort of, what does he mean by respect for national rights? Does he sort of mean that in terms of a conception of, Westphalian foreign policy? And I think this is, something which very much differentiates Gladstone from Disraeli. I mean, we talk about nations within the empire. Of course, I've already mentioned India, and of course, he elevated India 2 years before this in 1876 by elevating the Queen Victoria to Empress of India. So again, very much there was this idea of trying to ennoble and ingratiate the Indians into the administration, but also to enhance the prestige of the empire as well. But also, again, it's important to note that there were various the so-called white settler colonies, the dominions. Canada had already achieved autonomy at this point under its first Prime Minister, John A. Macdonald. But turn back to the idea of foreign policy, and again, why Disraeli is so different from Gladstone. 1878, of course, is the year of the Conference of Berlin. Do you know anything about the Eastern Question and the Conference of Berlin?
No. Why didn't you tell us?
Well, this is one of the, I guess, crowning achievements of AA's premiership. One of the things he's most famous for, which is in 1876, we have this major uprising in the Balkans against the Ottoman Empire. And in response, the Ottoman Empire sends in irregulars called the Bashi Bazouks. And it basically gives Gladstone a temporary moral win because he writes a series of pamphlets, which go essentially the equivalent of viral in those days, talking about the atrocities of the Bashi Bazouks and the inaction of Disraeli's government. And, again, you can almost detect a hint of Wilsonianism in that this, moralizing civilizing mission that Britain has to adopt a moral policy first, or an ideological policy first, before a self-interested national policy. And of course, Disraeli does the latter. He defends the Ottoman Empire when the Russians use what I've just outlined as a pretext to go to war. And he prevents the destruction of Ottoman power in Europe. And he prevents the Russians being able to annex a port on the Mediterranean, which, from an imperial point of view, would have threatened Britain in Malta. It would have threatened Britain, again, very important at this point. 1876, Disraeli purchases the controlling interest of the Suez Canal, which links India, Malaysia, and the eastern provinces with the Mediterranean. So he again is thinking about this logistically, and he's thinking about this as a grand vision of empire. And so the Ottoman Empire is essential as a bulwark to prevent the Russians expanding in, whilst at the same time the liberals are advocating for a position based on a moral policy. And of course, the great irony under Gladstone is that Gladstone would eventually have to implement the logic of Disraeli's imperial policy. When the Suez Canal is basically threatened, he ends up annexing Egypt, which is, of course, what Disraeli ultimately wanted to do.
Now, I remember reading something about Disraeli and the Suez Canal, which is that he bought it personally, like himself, and then sold it to the nation. Is that right?
Well, he essentially got a loan from his friend and political colleague, even on the other side, Lionel Freiherr Rothschild, for £4 million during those days. And the reason he did it essentially was because the Khedive, which was the title of the ruler of Egypt, I think Ali Pasha, was basically bankrupt, and he was selling them cheap. The controlling interest of the Suez Canal, and there was this genuine fear that the French would buy it before the English. So he essentially, personally, using essentially the British government as collateral, requested this loan from Freiherr Rothschild, and he granted it. I'm not sure about this buying it him personally and then granting it to the nation, but very much this was done beyond parliamentary scrutiny and in a matter of urgency to prevent the French nabbing it.
Yeah, I believe he then I believe he sold it to Britain once Britain could afford it.
Yeah,
I seem to remember. Can't remember exactly where I read that now. Don't think it's in this Taylor extract that we're going to read, but it was somewhere. Anyway, let's carry on.
I cannot conceive how our distant colonies can have their affairs administered except by self-government. But self-government, in my opinion, when it was conceded, ought to have been conceded as part of a great policy of imperial consolidation. It ought to have been accompanied by an imperial tariff.
I want to say that's Palpatine would be proud of that one.
Yes. Yes, the Republic will be reorganized into a galactic empire.
Imperial tariff.
Yeah. Yes.
It ought further to have been accompanied by the institution of some representative council in the metropolis, which would have brought the colonies into constant and continuous relations with the home government.
Pause. This is sorry. Go ahead, AA.
I mean, if I understand his plan right, he wants like an oversight committee of the government of the various colonies. So it's not really. It's kind of like a devolved government, but with a kind of some connecting line back to London. So it's not truly free. It's kind of there's a nice relationship back and forth between the foreign capital and London.
Yeah, I think this is, I guess, sort of I think what he's advocating for is actually some sort of universal parliament. And I think it's important to note that, Disraeli is very old and ill at this point. This is 1978. He would die 3 years later. And so he isn't able to expand upon this vision. But there is a politician who does expand on this vision, which is Joseph Chamberlain, who's colonial secretary for, I think, about 8 years, from about 1895 until 1903. And he mentioned their imperial tariff, and he mentioned there an imperial capital, at the idea of the metropolis. And very much that was the thinking of Joseph Chamberlain. And have you heard of imperial preference?
Why don't you explain it, and I'll tell you.
Well, on the one hand, Disraeli fails to repeal the Corn Laws, and again, the reason he fails to repeal the Corn Laws is because he has bought into the logic of democracy, and the Corn Laws ultimately mean smaller loaf of bread. So the revocation of the Corn Laws ultimately means the working classes are much more likely to support free trade over tariffs. But what I think imperial preferences, which is building upon this legacy, is almost like this idea of a proto-form of a single market, though using the colonies and using the dominions essentially as one unified economic bloc. And so essentially you get cheaper goods from within the empire and tax goods from without the empire. And again, I think it's also important to note that this wasn't unique at this time. This also happened in Germany, which practiced protectionism, and its economy was booming at this time. So, and we talk about free trade, and I think that fundamental problem comes up again in the government of Alpha Balfour, when Joseph Chamberlain proposes this, and what it does is destroy the Conservative Party and allows the Whigs to come in, Liberals to come in 1906, promising bigger loaves of bread under free trade. So this idea never really kicks off because electorally it's poison.
No, I mean I do remember that that failure to repeal the Corn Laws did cost him some support with the farmers, of course, who were kind of suffering during an economic downturn at one point. There's cheap grain coming in from America, and they're saying, listen, please bring the Corn Laws back because we're getting our asses kicked here. And he doesn't do it. So there's a distinction to be made between the rural agricultural working class and the urban working class at this point.
Yes, and again, it's sort of, he mentions on the one hand, some sort of harmonious relationship between them, but in terms of sort of the interests of the two groups, they're basically intractable. The urban classes in the borough constituencies want the larger loaf of bread, but the agricultural classes will never forgive Disraeli for ultimately supporting them.
Yeah, and that split between the rural and the urban poor is something to look out for across all of history, actually. I mean, it doesn't matter the nation. I remember when I've looked into the roots of the Iranian Revolution before, you can get one of those two blocks and you don't necessarily have the other one, right? So like in Iran, for example, the urban working class were kind of on the Shah's side, whereas the rural poor were for the revolution. Yeah. So, anyway, I also have a book here called Standard Bearers, British Roots of the New Right, to which Jonathan Bowden, who some audience members would have heard of, was a contributor. It's an old book. It was written in 1999.
Yeah.
And it's got a chapter on Disraeli, but it also has quite a big chapter on Joseph Chamberlain, who is seen as being one of the key figures in the history of the British right, as being a kind of a true man of the right. You'll note there's no Churchill chapter, for example. There's an Enoch Powell chapter, There's a Palmerston chapter. There's a Lord Salisbury chapter. There's a Disraeli chapter. There's no Churchill.
Yeah.
He's kind of kicked out.
Well, the fascinating thing about Joseph Chamberlain in particular, of course, he starts his career as a liberal and the Liberal Mayor of Birmingham, introducing all of these social reforms, again, using Disraeli's permissive legislation really is the impetus to do it. He's one of the ones who really embraces it. And he is very famously defects from the Liberal Party to go over and join the Conservatives. And that's where the Unionist Party comes from, which then joins with the Conservatives in, I think it's 1884, 1885, when Gladstone supports Home Rule. We talked about the perennial problem of Conservative politicians appropriating the One Nation Tory label, despite, ultimately it means nothing when they appropriate it. One politician who was very consciously in modern times trying to imitate Joseph Chamberlain was, of all people, Theresa May, using her I don't even know how to think, her policy wonk, Nick Timothy, when in reality all that Nick Timothy did was present left-wing policies as conservative, and there was nothing representing any sort of true form of nationalism, definitely not the imperialist form of nationalism that Joseph Chamberlain espoused.
Yeah, I mean, I'm convinced that Theresa May and Nick, what's his name, Nick, they had read that. They had read that David Goodhart book, the Road to Somewhere, and I know that because there was all sorts of Goodhart phrases plunked in without any kind of attempt to make them palatable or no. Do you remember the British Dream? That was a David Goodhart phrase.
Yeah.
Do you remember when she talked about the anywhere? The anywheres and the somewheres, like. The reason all that failed is because none of them were explained. Like, this is just like, you can't just take David Goodhart and just present it to the public as if anybody knows what you're talking about, right? You have to explain the thesis first, you have to, and that's actually something, whether you love her or hate her, Thatcher was very good at explaining. Before she hit you with the point. Theresa May was awful at that. It sounded so awkward. I could see what they were going for, and some of the, the grammar schools and I could see what they were trying to do, but I don't know. Yeah, just came off as Labour light, really. That's the problem. Anyway, let's carry on.
All this, however, was omitted because those who advised that policy, and I believe their convictions were sincere, I looked upon the colonies of England, looked even upon our connection with India as a burden on this country, viewing everything in a financial aspect.
Bean counters.
Yeah.
This is the dismal science, the Carlyle coming in. Yeah.
Yes. Well, didn't Disraeli also originate that wonderful quote? 3 types of lies: lies, damn lies, and statistics. But also, I mean, this speaks to your video, or when you were trying to claim that Britain didn't in fact own India. What was it, 49 trillion pounds or something? Yeah. Where Britain was the empire was ultimately it was a capital loss, and one of the overarching themes beyond this point, beyond Disraeli, is an attempt to try and limit the costs of the empire, not so much expand it in any way, because ultimately in many ways it was a financial liability holding all of these things together. One could even argue that the Triple Entente, which was used as the justification for taking us into World War I, was ultimately just a way of cost cutting.
Yeah, I mean, ironically though, part of this you could argue is Disraeli's fault, because when it was the East India Company running the show, that didn't have to show up on the government's books, right? Maybe the East India Company would have gone bust or whatever, but it still wasn't a problem of British taxpayer administration. As soon as it was brought onto the national balance sheet, then it's kind of difficult to say, well, hold on a second, we're losing a shitload of money here. What we're going to do? So anyway, let's carry on.
And totally passing by those moral and political considerations which make nations great, and by the influence of which alone men are distinguished from animals.
I think just a final point to make about the empire. This is during Disraeli's heyday, 1978. It really goes, downhill very quickly from there. Hence why he loses so badly in 1888. On the domestic front, we have the lingering effects of the, what's still called then the Great Depression. We have a series of bad harvests, which, even more so create the urgency for repeal of the Corn Laws among the agricultural sectors, which he still at that point is unable to do. But, mentioning the empire specifically and the concept of cost. During this time, the British fight against the Zulus in the First Zulu War, and they lose the Battle of East Landawala, which is considered, one of the most humiliating defeats in British imperial history. The first time a modern force was defeated by a native force. Something similar again happens in Afghanistan at this point. So he also leaves, I would say, at this point he has prestige, but he leaves behind towards the end of his premiership a legacy of a certain failure in that regard, because this is a huge cost to Britain, but it also damages her prestige. And of course, this also coincides with the First Boer War, and of course the Second Boer War should take place under his successor, Robert Cecil, Lord Salisbury, would also be equally disastrous.
How did they manage to lose the Zulus? They had guns, and the Zulus had melons. So Blackadder told me.
Well, I mean, on the one hand, we lost the Battle of East Landawala effectively because it's going to irritate me that I can't remember the general who's commanding the expedition, but the British Army had basically separated at that point into two, and the Zulus had effectively been able to ambush and overcome the British Army through speed, essentially through pure mobility, which is one of the assets of legacy of the military forms of Shaka Zulu. But at the same time, we had the Battle of Rorke's Drift, where an army, I think, is of 50 Brits are able to hold off against a major contingent of the Zulu army at the same time.
Yeah, led by Michael Caine, famously.
Yes.
You will now hear Disraeli delivering a passage from a speech which he made at Shrewsbury, which is all the more striking
Nice scene, isn't it?
when it is remembered that this speech was delivered almost 90 years ago.
I still believe there is but one way to extricate this country from the calamities which it now experiences and those which are impending. And that is by a frank adoption of the principle of reciprocity as the fundamental principle of your commercial code.
Now, this already is getting a bit Trumpian, I would say. If you listen to the core message here.
Mm.
And that such is the only way, the only means to pursue against hostile tariffs and countervailing duties. To tax the community for the advantage of a class is not protection, it's plunder. And I disclaim it. And I ask you to protect the rights and interests of labor generally, in the first place, by allowing no free imports from those countries which meet you with countervailing duties, and in the second, with respect to agricultural produce, to compensate the soil for those burdens from which other classes are free by an equivalent duty. That is my view of what is known as protection. I am not an enemy myself to free trade, according to my idea of free trade. But my idea of free trade is this: you cannot have free trade unless the person you deal with is as liberal as yourself. If I saw a prize fighter
Steve Bannon's like creaming himself watching this.
encountering a galley slave in irons, I should consider the combat equally as fair as to make England fight hostile tariffs with free imports.
So there you go. So he was a protectionist, economic nationalist.
Yeah.
When it came to trade,
Mm.
And that's it, I believe. So I think it just ends now, doesn't it? Yeah, that's it. So thanks, BFI. Really interesting little film, and I thought it was worth going through that.
Yeah.
So yeah. Any last comments on this video before we get on?
No, just to reiterate that that protectionist sentiment is really what kicks off Disraeli's career, because again, it's the advocacy against the original Tory betrayal. I don't mean Tory, I mean Conservative Party betrayal. The Tories, of course, had betrayed their constituency long before then. But no, this is his establishing a political career, and I think that's very important. And again, establishing himself as the ally of the agricultural classes, even though he isn't able to follow that up when he actually attains power.
Okay, so let's start then with Taylor. I'll just go just say pause or stop when you want to butt in. Okay. He said, so I read the first paragraph. He said, and yet no man belonged less to the society of Victorian England than Disraeli. He was, first of all, by birth, certainly not English. He was of Jewish origin. He was a baptized Christian, though he never troubled himself very much about this. He had no conventional education, where every other prime minister until David Lloyd George had been to one of the older universities, with the exception of the Duke of Wellington, but obviously the Duke of Wellington belonged to the aristocracy. Disraeli went to no university. I mean,
yes, he got an honorary
minister?
degree. Sorry, go ahead.
Is he the only prime minister ever not to go to university?
I don't think James Callaghan went to university, or if he did, he got some. I can't remember what sort of degree he got. But no, Disraeli got an honorary degree in Oxford, if I remember. Well, same as actually, no, this is important to note. We talk about Lord Salisbury. He did go. I think it was to Cambridge, and he got an honorary fourth, which I always found quite funny. As for his not being able to be ingratiated in British society, I mean, I think it is important to note that he was the favourite prime minister, with the possible exception of Lord Melbourne, of Queen Victoria, so much so that she dedicated a memorial to him. And, I think, despite his, again, we mentioned his strange upbringing, he very much did consider himself, again, as part of it, if not necessarily English ethnically, as part of this imperialistic conception, and try to combine his Jewishness with a idea of the British aristocracy. And the fact that he was able to, in his words, climb the greasy pole and rise to the top of the Conservative Party of all organizations, and the fact that he was recognized in that position, and he was able to win over hardcore conservatives at that point, like Robert Cecil, I do think he was able to win over a large section of English society and become ingratiated, even though there was always this particularism to him.
I find it really fascinating that Callaghan never went to university either. He was a tax inspector and then a trade union official.
Yeah. A very stark contrast to Harold Wilson.
Very interesting. Yeah, fascinating. Okay, so let's carry on. He had no background of the ordinary social kind. He had no wealth. Well, he had a certain amount of money from his father, but really a triviality. For most of his life, indeed, he was heavily in debt. It was only when he married a wealthy widow that he managed to escape the danger of being imprisoned for debt. So I didn't know that. I didn't know that he was so poor.
Well, again, bucking the stereotype, he started off as a financier, and he was useless at it. He made so many bad decisions during his time as a financier that he essentially, again, was forced out of the profession, and he acquired debts. I think he was still paying debts from his original profession until his second premiership as prime minister, to put in perspective. And despite his writing career being very successful, he was a best-selling author. Remember, really, it was his marriage to Marianne Lewis in 1839 that rescued him temporarily from that.
I would just like to say, do not be put off by the trucks in chat. Okay, this was the chat that when I was doing my top 100 books. Do you remember I mentioned there were cleavages in the great books, that there are points of dispute, cleavages. Of course, they were just tittering to themselves like members of the Carry On cast about because I said cleavage. This is the level of the chat. So just step over them, AM. Don't worry about their silliness.
I'll do just that.
It's Friday nights. They're all a bit fruity. So let's carry on. And even after that, when he was a leading politician, most of the furniture in his house was already mortgaged, marked off, pledged because of the great debt which he had accumulated. And it is said that he never freed himself from debt to the very end of his life. He managed to acquire fairly late in life some landed estate, but he only did it by borrowing from one of his aristocratic friends, and you cannot say that it was ever really his.
Mm.
Now, that does have, you've mentioned certain Rothschild a number of times. The debt thing does make me wonder, because if you ever watch Horace's video on Churchill, he makes a great deal of the fact that Churchill was constantly in debt, and therefore, in order to, let's just say, appease his debtors, embarked on certain policy choices, let's just say.
Yeah.
Any idea whether that impact on Disraeli's decision-making at all, this debt he was in all the time?
I mean, like I said, the only thing which I can, in terms of like direct political patronage, the Jewish Relief Act of 1858, whereby he essentially allows Freiherr Rothschild to become an MP. But I mean, it's also important to know that the Rothschilds were also bankrolling Britain during, not just Disraeli personally, but in terms of Britain, they were bankrolling Britain during the Crimean War and during the Napoleonic Wars as well. So, if there was a particular agenda the Rothschilds were advocating for, I think that's almost too spicy to discuss on this stream. But like I said, in terms of his friendship with the Rothschilds, we do see that manifested in 1958, and the same with the Suez crisis, where he's able to engineer that loan and therefore basically beat the French to buying the controlling interest.
Yeah, so he says he was a man indeed who exaggerated, if that were possible, his own differences. He looked different. He appeared in the most exotic clothes. He was a dandy of his time. He had heavy black ringlets which hung down to his shoulders. He spoke in an exaggerated, almost foreign drawl. He was never ashamed to say the most paradoxical things about his behaviour. He made it clear to his wife, who was much older than he was, that he had married her for her money, and yet at the same time he treated her with such attention and courtesy that he's able to say, "You've been more than a mistress than a wife to me."
Yeah, that's one of my favourite quotes.
You've been more a mistress than a wife to me. Bloody hell. So he was like a kind of toy boy with a sugar mummy, essentially.
Well, that's a classic thing with him. He consistently, this is when he get married. He's 35 when he gets married. Before then, he had a series of affairs with younger women. And I think this in particular, this aspect of him, Victoria finds very attractive, so much so that he's prepared to do the whole kneeling on the ground and doing the formal kissing of hands, which of course by that time had basically been disused. So it's very interesting, his relationship to women, especially older women.
Did he try to flash heart Victoria? Lord Flashheart from Blackadder. Let's carry on. Which of these were true, it would be impossible to say. What certainly is true is that she was devoted to him, and that he was on his side, derived strength from her care and attention which kept him going. Yet again, unlike most public men, he did not like public life. Oh, he liked a battle at the House of Commons, all right. And he liked, look at this very vernacular kind of conversational style of Taylor's here. I don't know what I make of it. It's a kind of very, very conversational, the way this is written. But anyway, he says, oh, he liked the battle at the House of Commons, all right. And he liked scoring political success. He liked saying clever things, but he didn't like social life. He was that very rare thing, at any rate in this country, a man who was happy only in the society of women. I think Dee's estimation for Disraeli is going down as we speak. Men's society, men's clubs, and after all, the House of Commons was the greatest club of of the time bored him. He found no satisfaction in them. He was not interested in exchanging ideas or gossip or anything of that kind with other men. Public dinners, all the grandeur of public life, were not at all for him, except purely as matters of display. It's kind of a bit unusual.
Well, I mean, one of the most interesting thing about him is I mentioned that he lost to Gladstone in 1868. He's technically leader of the opposition from 1868 to 1874. What's he do during that time? He doesn't spend his time like debating like the disestablishment of the Church of England and Ireland, or breaking the aristocratic grip over certain positions in the civil service and the army, as Gladstone's trying to basically make it to a meritocratic institution, the army and the civil service. What's he doing during that time? He's writing a novel. he doesn't care, and so much of the conservative politicians of the time are basically like, what the hell are you doing? And it's really, he doesn't come in onto the political stage really until 1872, where he makes a series of speeches, the most famous being the Crystal Palace one, but also I can't remember what the venue is. I think it was in Manchester, where he made this wonderful speech again, saying that the Liberal cabinet can be compared to a range of exhausted volcanoes. No, very much you see towards the end where he believes there's some sort of purpose in getting back into politics for the sake of winning an election and power. He's prepared to enter public life, but for most of his time as official leader of the opposition, he just doesn't care.
This reminds me a little bit, and this is going to be a very weird comparison, but like Theresa May again, because Theresa May famously was a politician for a very long time, right? She's had a long career, became the prime minister, but famously didn't have any friends, and she didn't hang out. She didn't.
I think I can see the comparison you're making, but I think that comes down to the fact that Theresa May had no charisma whatsoever, and I think she was also. Anyone ever watching her speeches? It was excruciating watching her. It was almost anxiety invoking. Watching her speak. I don't mean to be that mean, but really, it really was. I'm
convinced that Theresa May probably does have autism. Yeah.
Yeah,
or something similar.
There was also paranoia, I think, to consider. I think she had what I find so fascinating about Theresa May is this wonderful combination of a complete lack of talent and a almost dictatorial, centralizing control and supreme self-confidence combined with a lack of charisma. It's very strange. I don't think I've seen it in any other historical figure.
Yeah, but whereas Disraeli was charismatic, but he just didn't like to hang out with.
Yeah. I just think he got bored. I think it was just a pure matter of boredom as opposed to some sort of social aversion which Theresa May had.
Then again, if we ask, what was he, says Taylor, before he built himself up in politics, what did he show? He was a successful, flashy novelist. I use the term flashy because I think it's the only one that describes his books. They are still readable, though they are at the same time extremely trivial. No one could take them seriously as pictures of politics, as pictures of human beings, or as pictures of society. Why does Taylor hate these novels so much?
I have no idea. I really do beg to differ. I think I prefer reading Disraeli's novels compared to any bloody biography I've ever read of Disraeli. Most biographies on Disraeli are awful. No, the books in particular, especially I think you're always in awe, reading books of that time, how much, subsequent society has been dumbed down. And, reading something like Tancred, you have an incredibly interesting discussion really about the relationship between Judaism and Christianity. And like I said, you also see a very interesting trend of Tory historiography, real Tory historiography elucidated in Sybil and Coningsby, which, for its own sake is worth reading, even though, I actually find the political subjects of the books more interesting than the the actual romance aspect of the books, which is so common. I mean, one very interesting thing in Sybil in particular is that he's writing about immigration, and he's aware from the working class point of view how damning immigration, this is from Ireland in the 1840s, how damning immigration is in terms of lowering wages. They're all very conscious at that time that immigration leads to lowering wages, and he even makes the comparison between the arrival of the Visigoths and the various other German tribes in the fall of Rome. So in that way, again, he's particularly based.
They are full of brilliant remarks of fantasies. We could almost compare them, although they are not of the same level, with the 20th century novels of Evelyn Waugh. Do you know, when I was at Oxford, there was a bunch of guys who were just Evelyn Waugh guys. You know, they really embraced that Brideshead Revisited thing, and wanted to try to pretend that they were in Brideshead Revisited all the time. As you can imagine, I had little time for that. But I mean, I remember this one guy literally wore white kid gloves and a cape around the place, which really? I kind of secretly admired it, but also thought he was a bit of a twat at the same time. So.
Well, have you seen those? Was that article going around of that 25-year-old who apparently burnt his jeans when he was 14 and has become a Regency dandy ever since?
Yeah, I've seen that. Yeah.
AA. Hello.
Can you hear me? Sorry.
Yeah. I can hear you.
I kind of simultaneously want to do that, but never would, and so seethe with kind of contempt for both the person who does it and then also the idea of everybody being the same. So this is long be one of the paradoxes of my personal tastes. Anyway, let's carry on. They are that far remote from real life, and it was these flashy, frivolous novels with which Disraeli first made his name. So there we go. He says, in politics, he first made a name, or first attempted to break into politics as a radical, capital R radical. In the early days after the Great Reform Act, radical creeds urging further and more extreme reform, denouncing the aristocracy for maintaining the control over the state, commanded wide attention. Disraeli was one of the most extreme radical writers. His early novels are, in a sense, radical tracts, although this is mixed up with all kinds of aristocratic romanticism.
Yeah, and I think we've done quite a good job in terms of actually describing that. No, these are not radical. Not obviously, you know, from a particular point of view, you can read progressivism into something like Carlyle, even though it's advocating, I would say, a much older position from the right in opposition towards liberal economics.
I mean, I would say this is a kind of how can I put this kindly? This is a kind of bit of midwittery from Taylor, really.
Yeah.
His inability to get out of his own kind of, you know, like soft socialism, I guess you'd call it, right?
Well, I'm fascinated actually, because I haven't read this section from AJP Taylor. I have plenty of books on him. They're actually better written, you know, in particular Bismarck. Bismarck, of course, a wonderful person to compare to Disraeli because they are so similar in many regards. And no, I think I'm surprised by the rank mediocrity of this narrative, really, because I mean, it's so obvious to me, you know, someone who's, again, relatively versed in the various historiographical traditions at that time, who can draw the connection with Carlyle and see the difference. But, you know, the fact he can't is quite surprising.
He says his early novels are, in a sense, radical tracts, although this is mixed up with all kinds of aristocratic romanticism. He attempted to get into Parliament as a radical. It was only when he failed that he attempted to get into Parliament as a Conservative, and he succeeded. He was, I cannot say an obscure backbencher. Nobody can say that Disraeli was ever obscure, but he certainly was a backbencher without influence. So was he kind of like a Jacob Rees-Mogg character?
No, I disagree with this. You know, in terms of obscurity. Of course, he has these wonderful epic debates, which I mentioned. Daniel O'Connell, one of the leaders of Irish Catholicism during that time, and a forerunner of someone like Charles Stewart Parnell, the leader of Irish Home Rule. That's very much like a backbench altercation. But he comes to the forefront of the Conservative Party, after only 8 years as an MP in 1845, as basically the intellectual opposition to Robert Peel. And after that, he really serves as the most preeminent politician within the House of Commons, because of course the head of the Conservative Party and the Conservative Prime Minister during this time, Edward Stanley, is of course sitting in the Lords.
When in 1841 Peel formed his second Conservative government, Disraeli wrote abjectly asking for a post. Peel did not even answer him. It did not occur to Peel that Disraeli was a man of any importance, nor indeed would he have been, except for an extraordinary event. The Conservative Party stood for protection, and in particular for the Corn Laws, which imposed tariffs on foreign corn in order to benefit the landed proprietors of this country. In the year 1845, Peel decided that the Corn Laws were wrong, and that they must be repealed, that free trade must be established. I can see Taylor is really, really condensing and simplifying here. This must be for a particular
There's also
audience.
there's also something to note about Peel. I mean, A.J.P. Taylor loved Peel. He believed Peel was one of the greatest prime ministers of the 19th century. So the fact that Disraeli was scorned by Peel, I think, does play into the historical conception that A.J.P. Taylor has. Of course, who was the protege of Peel? It wasn't Disraeli. It wasn't the future of the Conservative Party. It was the future of the Liberal Party. It was Gladstone.
Yeah. I mean, it's so obvious, like he's getting his shots in wherever he can. This was a repudiation of some basic things that the Conservative Party stood for. Nevertheless, Peel's prestige was so great. He had been Prime Minister for years. He was the outstanding statesman at the time, that it looked as if he would carry his reluctant followers with him. Disraeli seized the opportunity, and it was in his attacks on Peel that he first came to the front. And the gentlemen of England found themselves cheering this strange character and being led by him in order to defend the Corn Laws. Again, this is characteristic of Disraeli. He was not interested in the Corn Laws at all. A year or two later, when he has established himself more or less at the head of the Conservative Party, he was publicly willing to say that this was a closed issue and that free trade was here for good. He never understood the arguments either for free trade or against them.
No, that's ridiculous.
Or if he understood them, he had no interest in them.
That's absolutely ridiculous.
I switched to Taylor because people hated the other historian, but
I mean, but it's wonderful to have a bit of a laugh, I suppose. But I mean, even from the clips we saw there, I mean, he clearly did have a very concrete vision from the beginning, but also at the end, it wasn't so much that he believed that free trade was a closed issue. Really, he was trying to manage this idea between imperial preference and free trade, and seeing how politically toxic one idea was. And of course, when Joseph Chamberlain tries for imperial preference, it proves to be politically fatal. So that's always a consideration. It doesn't come from any sort of intellectual lackingness on the part of Disraeli.
This, I think, was the most What he disliked or claimed to dislike in Peel was lack of consistency. Free trade should be carried, yes, but it should be carried by a Liberal government, not a Conservative one. This, I think, was the most important contribution which Disraeli made to our political history, the concept of a fully two-party system. Up to that time, men, even when they were out of office, were a bit ashamed to oppose what was called the King's or the Queen's government. Opposition seemed not quite treasonable, of course, but seditious, or at any rate disloyal. Now it was Disraeli who first fully formulated the idea that the function of an opposition is to oppose, and that there should be clear-cut lines of distinction between the parties. If the Liberal Party stands for one thing, the Conservative Party stands for the other. The prime duty of a politician, of a statesman, is therefore both to form a party and then to be loyal to the things that it stands for. Fair?
I don't really understand. I mean, it would help if he gave some examples as to what he's getting at, because from a point of view of Whig versus Tory history, Disraeli is a paradox in the sense that he creates an actual modern, functioning, campaigning Conservative Party with a central office and MPs who are basically dependent on a programme. At the same time, the idea of an actual political party is really anathema to ancient Toryism. Liberalism, I mean, if he's basically trying to advocate that liberalism during this time had some sort of united platform, that's completely ridiculous. One of the consistent themes throughout the entire history of the Liberal Party of the 19th, and indeed the 20th century, is that they were always alternating between the classical liberals and the radical liberals. And as we see with David Lloyd George after, 1908, the radical liberals win. And as a result, we lost the classical Liberal Party and it was ultimately subsumed into Labour. So I think it's much more complicated than this idea of loyalty to party, also mentioning the fact that within the two parties, there were various movements which defected to other sides. So say, from the example, the Conservatives, Robert Peel formed the Peelites, which defected to the Liberals and basically became subsumed. And then from the Liberals, we had the Unionists who defected to the Conservatives. So again, I'm not I can't really quite grasp what he's getting at, because there is really nothing tangible in terms of an actual political event to grasp onto.
I'm going to have to close chat so I can't see it, because they're talking about fried chicken, beef Wellingtons, making mushrooms, coleslaw. I mean, come on.
Yes, I have been noticing, and I'm absolutely appalled.
I mean, Charlemagne and Dee, utter disgraces, both of them. They are the twin nodes of subversion in the chat. So let's carry on. If we take the case of Peel, the Conservative Party stood for the Corn Laws. Peel therefore had a duty to defend them. If he became convinced that the Corn Laws were wrong, then it was simply his duty to withdraw from public life. It's certainly not to lead his party into doing the opposite of what it previously had stood for. It was this doctrine of party consistency which Disraeli preached. Of course, the idea of loyalty to the party, the idea that men should stand together, that they only be able to rely on each other to carry out a policy, if only they knew what it was attractive, particularly to backbenchers. The backbencher is less likely to be persuaded at any time by high considerations of reason or the needs of public policy. He understands crude, simple issues. He is for the Corn Laws, whatever it may be, and expects his leaders to be as simple and as straightforward as himself. Disraeli, the most complicated figure of the 20th century, presented himself as a simple, straightforward leader of the English country gentlemen, not only backbenchers, but one might say backwoodsmen. And he secured the leadership of the Conservative Party simply because he was ready to defend its interests, to put the needs of the party first all the time, to appear as an avowed leader of the opposition, so that whatever the government was doing, Disraeli would stand up and tear it to pieces. This, of course, was an enormously enjoyable role, particularly for an intellectual. And Disraeli, I think, comes in this category. The intellectuals are destructive. It is much easier to criticize. There is in Disraeli's speeches a wonderful anthology of destructive remarks. I think it is true that there are more quotations from Disraeli than from any other British statesman in all our dictionaries of quotations. He was always saying clever things, but they were all destructive things. They were all about...
I think what you've elucidated from AJP Taylor there, I would almost say it's the Gladstonian version of how to construe Disraeli, whereby you have this clever, articulate man who was completely devoid of principles, who did the unthinkable. He betrayed Peel. He basically destroyed the Conservative Party and forced, true conservatives like Gladstone out of the party. And therefore, there is this constant animosity towards Disraeli as the ultimate destructor, and that anything coming out of Disraeli must be some sort of sham. It must be some sort of drama. And, of course, Gladstone thought that's what the 1867 Reform Act was. It was just Disraeli trying to essentially outmaneuver and destroy the Liberals for temporary political gain, even though I've tried to explain that there was a clear political vision elucidated in his novels, dating back from at least 20 years before the Reform Act was passed. And he had, in fact, tried to pass a similar Reform Act when he was in government in 1859.
Well, what are you talking about, a serious vision? In the Taylor said they're frivolous novels, high fantasy, he said.
Well, at least he's consistent.
Anyway, he was always saying clever things, but they were all destructive things. They were all about how mistaken or foolish or confused the other people are. Leadership of the party did not bring Disraeli to high office, or at least not for a long time. The Conservative Party of the 19th century had got stuck with a single interest, the interest of the landed classes. And even this interest was not desperately at stake. The Liberal governments at the time carried measures which, though they were not exclusively in the interests of the landed class, were making Great Britain more prosperous. The idea of an England run solely by the territorial aristocracy had been jettisoned, even by most members of the aristocracy. Disraeli seemed to represent a romantic, decaying idea, a sort of political Jacobitism. His justification, and he put this forward often in his writings, was that to act at all, he must have a hard, consolidated party behind him. And if this meant many years of minority position where, if he got into office at all, as he did as Chancellor of the Exchequer in 1852 and again in 1858, it was only in a minority government. This was worthwhile because, unless a statesman has a hard and united party behind him, you could never move forward. It was in this conception of making up the party a solid, organized thing, building it up in terms of organization and finance, of cooperation, the readiness of one man to work with another, that Disraeli was important. Disraeli's Conservative Party was the first which had real party funds, which had a central organization, which began to treat politics as a national affair, which could be run from a centre. At a time when the Liberal Party was hard to raise £20,000 for an election, the Conservative Party could always pull in £100,000.
Yes, and I think this
of the organisation which Disraeli had built up.
And I think this is, again, after getting through again a lot of nonsense, I think, in terms of Disraeli being content to lead a minority government so long he's able to consolidate the Conservative Party, he does touch on one point, which again I mentioned was the paradox, that he was able to create a modern party machine. At the same time, Liberals were unable to even put up candidates in various constituencies, and this modern party machine, which would be inherited by Robert Cecil, Lord Salisbury, really is incredibly successul. From 1884, which again is the third Reform Act instituted by Gladstone, we essentially have more or less 20 years of Conservative government. There are minor Liberal interludes in 1886 and 1892 to 1894. But essentially, the Conservatives are able to master party politics in a way that the Liberals aren't able to master party politics. And of course, they're always, riven by factional interests. And, Gladstone, having, originally been a very conservative politician, high Anglican, becomes low Anglican Protestant. And he advocates for, among other things, Irish Home Rule, which is completely destructive to the Liberal Party. I think it's also important to note that his own reforms, whether it be the secret ballot of 1872, whilst the secret ballot is a fine democratic principle, what is the effect of the secret ballot for the Liberal Party? The tenants can no longer intimidate the electorate into voting for the Liberal Party, so they all vote for Irish Home Rule, therefore losing the Liberal Party Ireland basically forever at that point. What happens after 1884? Well, the Conservatives have already appealed to the working class with their various reforms, so it actually keeps the Liberals out of power for 22 years. So I think this organizational ability on behalf of Disraeli and his foresight, I would say his actually command of democratic politics, is something to be credited. AA? Okay, we've lost
Yeah.
You're back. Wonderful.
It's the USB here. Okay, shall we continue? I've decided, AM, that chat is so fruity this evening, talking about food, that this might be a good time, directly following this stream, to head over to AA Gold and do my ranking of the cooking, since they're all talking about food. I think I'm thinking of Kairos. I've been writing Foundations of Rhetoric. I think this is the opportune time to do a food stream because they're all talking about food. So I directly after this stream, I'm going to head over to AA Gold for a little bonus fun stream. But let us continue. Okay. Disraeli had another tactic. Just on the organization front, do you think it's fair to say that the machine that the Tory party is today, arguably the most successful political party of all time, owes a lot of that to Disraeli?
Yeah. Also, the fact, I mean, one of the important things to note about early 19th century MPs versus late 19th century MPs is that early 19th century MPs could basically stand on their own platform, and invariably they tended to have a political patron, like a various aristocrat or a constituency, and they did self-funding. So, of course, there wasn't a parliamentary salary at that point. Parliamentary salaries come in later. When we have the coordination and the dependence on a centralized party machine, we also have a greater level of uniformity and indeed conformity, and the power of the whips go up. So it's basically a double-edged sword. On the one hand, you're able to win elections and present a unified series of policies, and yet on the other, you basically undermine the individual power of the representatives, which is, again, the core theme of the expanding party apparatus.
Disraeli has another tactic, says AJP Taylor, another thing which made him interesting and important. He was the only 19th century statesman, I think, or certainly the outstanding 19th century statesman in this country, who analysed politics not just in terms of ideas and principles, but in terms of class. It was Disraeli who said, liberalism is middle class. If therefore we give the vote to the working class, they will go to the aristocracy, party above the middle class, just as the workers are the party below. This is why he himself carried working class suffrage in 1867, what his then leader, Lord Derby, has called a leap in the dark. And 7 years later, in 1874, he was rewarded. The Conservatives won their first majority since the time of Peel in 1841. And there's the David Starkey point about the high and the upper class and the working class against the rancid middle, for which Disraeli is, famous. Do you think it's fair to say that this is a big success of his, bringing in working class suffrage?
Well, like I said, it's short-termistic. I mean, my personal view is, because he's not able to change the political system, rather he is conforming conservatism within the political system he finds himself, and he's able to beat the Liberals at their zeal for reform. Often, as I said with Gladstone, it's often self-defeating reform from a political point of view. They're able to use it for a political cause to try and attach themselves to a constituency to maintain their hold on power, which previously the Tory hold had been based on their relationship with the monarch. When he basically says like he's a romantic Jacobite, I mean, one of the things that distinguishes him from a Jacobite is, of course, he is not in any way an absolutist. He believes in the power of the monarchy, the institution of the monarchy, but he believes he has to wed himself to this new constituency, the working class. However, as we see, that means when we have the rise of socialism and the destruction of the Liberal Party, and really the end of a classical liberal opposition, what is the result? The Conservatives espousing one nation Toryism just accept and repackage Labour policies and sell them as conservative. I mean, this is especially true after you have the Clement Attlee government from 1945 to 1951, and basically from 1951 to 1963 under Churchill, second term Eden and Macmillan. You have a continuation of basically all the economic policies to the extent there basically is no disagreement between Labour and the Conservatives. So I think it is reliant on a classical liberal opposition. And when you have a Labour opposition against the Conservatives from an economic point of view, I think it's just cancerous.
Yes, of course. I mean, it's a move that basically killed. And don't forget, the Liberals had to become what they call modern Liberals after this point. If you read Herbert Spencer's The Man versus the State, he's essentially attacking the Liberals in that because they are, going back on all their liberal policies. So,
I mean, David Lloyd George is anathema to Gladstone. I mean, Gladstone has more similarities with Margaret Thatcher than Gladstone has similarities with David Lloyd George. And, again, what do we have with David Lloyd George? We have the People's Budget. We have the attack on the House of Lords. Again, the Liberals were, the Whigs were always, to some extent pro-aristocracy. They're not as much as the Conservatives. But what is the attack on the House of Lords? It's an attack on property rights. It's increasing taxes. And of course, we see a massive increase in the size of the state after Asquith is removed from power in 1916 and the wartime administration of Lloyd George begins. So yes, I think it also kills the Liberal Party because first of all, it splits the Liberal Party between Lloyd George and Asquith. Asquith, who could be said to be more of a traditional classical liberal, even though, again, he's not presidential in the sense that someone like a Disraeli or a Lloyd George is. But essentially, you know, the liberal movement gets subsumed and gets co-opted by Labour. And of course, their alliance with Labour starts with the People's Budget in 1910. It's Labour votes in addition to Irish Home Rule votes that are needed to push forward this.
So let me continue then. He says, Disraeli became Prime Minister for a second time. He had been Prime Minister for a short time in 1868. This time he had a great majority behind him. He actually made two remarks when he became Prime Minister. The first was characteristic. Whereas Gladstone, when he became Prime Minister, talked about great public policies and his mission to do this or that, Disraeli merely said in a light-hearted way, well, I've climbed to the top of the greasy pole. His other remark was sadder. And that phrase, the greasy pole, of course, is much used in Westminster, isn't it? His other remark was sadder. He said, power has come to me too late. Once I could have reshaped empires, now I am too old. Whether he really could have reshaped empires when he was younger, it would be difficult to decide. All right, Taylor. I mean, this is really surprising for me.
I mean, I think he did considering how old was he when he became Prime Minister for a second? 70. I think he did a pretty good job in his first 4 years out of the 6-year term, considering how old he was and considering he was also extremely ill throughout most of that time and would die almost immediately after he resigned as Prime Minister.
So let's carry on. He showed little in the nature of a constructive planned policy. He was a man of experience, and the excuse was that he was too old, that he had lost his zest, is one that he would have to make, perhaps in any case. This is not to say that Disraeli's government of 1874 was without importance. It was important in itself. It broke the long run of the Liberal governments and the Liberal majorities. It showed that British politics were taking a different form. It vindicated, after 30 years, Disraeli's argument in favour of the two-party system. For the time, when one party had become discredited, feeble, confused, another party was able to present itself, as it were, ready-made, not on the ruins of the old, but simply as an alternative to the other one, and to say, well, we're ready to take over with new men, fresh men, new ideas. Whether the claim was justified or not, the existence of this second party was really established in 1874 and set the pattern for most of British politics thereafter.
I mean,
moreover,
this sort of cynicism. I mean, essentially, that it is basically a function, of the system. Oh, this party isn't doing so well. Oh, look, I have fashioned an alternative. That's essentially the argument he's making. I mean, maybe later, when there is essentially no difference between various Labour and Conservative governments, where a party simply exists to form basically this democratic idea of controlled opposition, as we're also familiar with. Maybe even today, the Conservative Party forms that function. It's just the one that isn't Labour. But again, in those days, I think he was advocating for a genuinely different platform from the Liberals, both on traditional social values, but also in terms of a entirely new conception of England, and also mentioned the fact that Disraeli's imperialism, which is a much more concerted and articulate view of imperialism and foreign policy in general, was never articulated by the Liberal Party. The closest thing you had to it was Lord Rosebery, who was by no means a successful prime minister for the brief time he was in.
Moreover, Disraeli's programme was not all pretense. When he talked about winning working class votes, he did not think solely in terms of class resentments. He was more receptive than Liberals to the policy of social reform. Liberalism was still individualistic. It was still an individualistic and negative creed. Disraeli was able to envisage a mass of people, a part of the community, and to do things for them. The early years of Disraeli's government, 1874 to 1876, were marked by the first great advances in social reform in terms of welfare, in terms of housing, and doing various other things for the mass of poor people. The trade unions, for instance, were given by Disraeli a privileged position which they still maintain. I am perfectly prepared to say that this was the first government genuinely sympathetic to the poor and needy as a distinctive element of society which Great Britain has held. This was one element of Disraeli's policy, the policy of welfare.
Just one note. He mentions trade unions. I think it's important to understand at this time that when he's talking about trade unions, he's talking about professional trade unions of skilled workers. He's not talking about the mass trade union movement that would come in later.
Yes, and one thing I will say is that, again, in these many books of economic data I have, one of the data points is days lost to union, to industrial action.
Yeah.
And the 1890s are insane for days lost to strikes. I mean, they are, like, we think the 70s are bad. If you can imagine a graph where, I don't know, in the 70s they lost, I don't know, like 200 days or something. I think in 1895, the graph almost kind of spikes so high it goes off the page. So I don't really know what was going on in the 1890s there, but they had like an epidemic of strikes shortly after this period, 20 years later after this.
Yeah.
So and anyway, he was more receptive than so we did that. Yeah, the other element, which in his speeches had been in the nature of window dressing, was imperial grandeur. In terms of words, Disraeli was the first imperial statesman of the 19th century, the first one who talked about the British Empire rather than simply the United Kingdom and the policies we conduct in this country. In practical terms, his actions did not amount to much. Disraeli's imperialism was shelved. The only mark which he left in imperial history was to give the Queen the title Empress of India. Nothing was changed except the title. Great Britain had been directly ruling India ever since the Indian Mutiny, and the Queen had been Queen of India too.
And he's going to ignore the fact that Disraeli was also instrumental in that as well. Again, it's just I don't know. You can even I know AJP Taylor well enough to know he was completely opposed to empire. You know, he was a socialist and he was a pacifist. But as we see, really there is a intellectual movement behind the empire, and as we talked about, imperial preference, the idea of a united imperial parliament, being able to reform the relationships between the essentially what he would refer to as the cottage and the castle. The issue really isn't so much that these ideas weren't going on, is that the Conservatives weren't able to implement them successfully. And I think ultimately it will be the Conservative Party that do abandon this, but it'll be much later. I mean, you saw that little clip with Stanley Baldwin. Stanley Baldwin would basically completely go back on that in 1934, I can't remember exactly the year, where all the Dominion countries, you know, Australia, New Zealand, and Canada, were basically held to be of equal stature to the Parliament of the United Kingdom. Therefore, basically moving them from dominions to basically the Commonwealth really happens under Stanley Baldwin. I think also we have with Churchill, and we have with Anthony Eden, and even, you know, Labour prime ministers like Clement Attlee. From that point of view, it's really a process of managed decline. But there was, from, you know, the 1870s until really before the First World War. And I think, you know, you have to understand the First World War as the turning point in this, is that after the First World War, despite the fact that Britain gained territorially from it, you know, through the mandates and, you know, areas such as the mandate of Palestine, you know, talking about Disraeli and the Israeli connection. You know, there's the Balfour Declaration in 1917, which is seen as basically the origin of the Zionist movement. But again, the effect of the World War I is that the British Empire is essentially bankrupt, and is bankrupted even more after World War II. And so the empire just whittles down continuously, and we see that especially after Suez. And the loss of India again is crucial for the destruction of the imperial project. So again, to view Disraeli as completely inconsequential, I think is just ridiculous. And I think it comes from in hindsight, Disraeli wasn't actually that effective because the empire came to an end. And I think that's an incredibly superficial view to take.
He says that the Queen had been the Queen of India too, but this was something just like Disraeli's clothes, his diamonds and his ringlets. The title Empress was to give a glitter to the idea of empire. In terms of real colonial expansion or bringing the empire together, Disraeli contributed nothing. He brought, it is true, a majority or a considerable number of shares in the Suez Canal, and this has often been pointed to as the beginning of imperialism in Egypt. But it was, but very much only at the beginning. The significance of this has been overrated. It was more of a gesture than anything else.
I think the Egyptians would disagree with that. I don't know what. I mean, I really was expecting better from H.E.P. Taylor. I mean, I understand his political inclinations, but it really is like he's coming at this, from the point of view of being a Sir Robert Peel apologist. Therefore, Disraeli is the arch enemy, and coming at this from the socialist of the 1920s, who's basically the ruins of the British Empire. So basically looking at him both ways as on the one hand a traitor and a superficial charlatan, and the other hand as a complete and utter failure. It's so I would say intellectually dishonest, especially taking out all the context of the time.
To his surprise, he was involved in a great crisis of foreign affairs. None of this has any solid background. You cannot trace a tradition in Disraeli's policy. He grabbed an opportunity of display. He wanted to show that Great Britain was an independent power. He opposed Russia because he was fascinated with the glamour of the East.
No. He's consistently, in his speeches, he's consistently warning about Russia. He's always sort of involved in the great game. I mean, talking about Orientalism, I'm sorry, Disraeli was fascinated with many different countries, in particular Arabia and the Middle East. And again, of course, he had a fascination with Russia. But to view it as just, there was a crisis, I guess I have to find some sort of response. No, I think I've already tried to explain when we were watching those clips that Disraeli definitely had a conception not only of imperial prestige, but also of the logistics of maintaining the empire in the Mediterranean, and how Russia was threatening the British Empire, first through the Mediterranean and secondly through Afghanistan. I think, he had a very clear understanding of these issues, hence why, Suez was so important to his consideration. So this is always consistent. There's always a consistent policy there. I don't see a radical change in him at all.
He moved. I'd pay to see a debate between you and H.E.P. Taylor. To be honest.
We need to resurrect him.
Unfortunately, Taylor's gone. He moved fleets and sent Indian troops to Malta, not because of any practical British interests were at stake, but because these were. Sorry, I'm laughing because I see how the sentence ends. He moved fleets and sent Indian troops to Malta, not because any practical British interests were at stake, but because these were sensational and glamorous things to do.
Oh my God! That was nothing to do with the fact that the Russians were about to make a massive military presence felt in the Aegean. No, it was to demonstrate the pageantry of empire. What utter nonsense! I mean, this is the thing he's lauded for. He's lauded essentially as a brinkman. Bringing again. When it comes especially to realpolitik, and Bismarck understood this as well, and maybe one day make a comparison between Disraeli and Bismarck as the two originators of conservatism, Disraeli from the English tradition, Bismarck from the continental tradition. But Bismarck understood, he did the same thing during the Crimean War, just having the presence of troops at selected points, especially Malta, the central point in the Mediterranean, which connects the entire British maritime empire there. Is an incredibly strong signal to the Russians that the Mediterranean is in part of the British sphere of influence. And without those troops, again, how were the Russians, Tsar Alexander II, supposed to take this seriously? And he routinely used these sort of policies. I mean, even threatening at one point to declare war on Russia, using his special, the special train. I have a train waiting for me. I'm going back. I do not have a response to declare war on Russia. So again, I would say. And Bismarck again was at this conference, the Conference of Berlin, and he referred to himself, the old Jew, but was ultimately brilliant as a diplomat and very again exemplifying a consistent policy. So I don't know why H.G.P. Taylor. I've hypothesized the idea of the betrayal appeal and him being a socialist. But this seems because as a historian, I'm not that objective. I approach things from a reactionary point of view, but I am almost blushing at the fact that he is not in any way trying to represent even a straw man from Disraeli's point of view.
You got to admit, though, all those things you just mentioned were glamorous, weren't they? Russian royalty and.
Yes. Look at all the pretty crowns. Look at all the jewels and emeralds. Look, Disraeli wore jewels and emeralds. That's the extent of his political vision.
When he was at the Congress of Berlin in 1878, he told Bismarck how he was planning to acquire Cyprus. And Bismarck said to him, "Splendid, that is progress. You see, these two old scamps sitting around grabbing other people's territories thought this was progress because it showed off. It hit the headlines. Everything." Was he drunk? Was he drunk when he wrote this? Honestly,
I mean, just to disprove that point. Again, we're talking about a Mediterranean empire during this point in the logistics. What does Cyprus do? Britain already had a serious interest in Cyprus, dating back from Napoleon's conquest of Egypt in 1798. Cyprus really is the key to augmenting that region between Malta, Crete is the other island, and of course Churchill plays particular interest to this during World War II, and holding up the Suez Canal. There is a major strategic influence. And of course, when it comes to Bismarck, of course, A.J.P. Taylor is going to say that, because he believes that was all Germany's interest throughout its entire history, just to grab land at the expense of its neighbors. He's one of the originators of the horrific Sonderweg thesis.
Even I am shocked by how dashed off this is by Taylor. What the hell? This is shocking. These two scamps sitting around grabbing other people's territories. What? Anyway, let's carry on. Everything that Disraeli did was designed in terms of sensation. When he came back from the Congress of Berlin, he coined the famous phrase that this was peace with honor. Well, really, it did not amount to very much. The Congress of Berlin settled a relatively trivial issue for a relatively short time.
Just to put this in perspective, it basically set the tempo of diplomatic relations in that region for 30 years. It wasn't insignificant by any means.
Relatively trivial issue, a relatively short amount of time.
For goodness, I'm shocked by this. I mean, what is the ultimate force that is required to turn over this this mammoth achievement by Disraeli? It is the Russian-Austrian interest in the Balkans and the Balkan Wars, one of the main leading causes for the First World War. So we're not talking about trivial issues. We are talking about the build-up to one of the biggest conflicts ever. And Disraeli is one of the few politicians who is able to maintain peace in the Balkans, which is always seen as a perennial problem. And this is a trivial issue. I mean, especially considering the events of World War I, to look back on this state and say it's irrelevant, not of note, it's incredibly intellectually dishonest.
The Congress of Berlin was settled a relatively trivial issue for a relatively short time, but it was a sensational thing. It soon ran out. The last years of his government were marred by sensations which did not come off, by confusions in South Africa, by an aggressive war in Afghanistan, and in 1880 the Conservatives were defeated. At the end of his life,
sorry. What I find interesting about that is that he basically belittles the obvious accomplishments of Disraeli, and he basically gives the two most humiliating aspects of his imperial policy. One that I've admitted, really brings down this whole conception of empire associated with prestige and finance. And he doesn't pay any attention to it. It's astounding. I mean, he doesn't even mention the battle where the Zulus were defeated, just, issues in South Africa. It's ridiculous.
At the end of his life, Disraeli had only the consolation that he had done these sensational things that whether or not he had permanently altered the face of the British Empire, he had established the two-party system, and that, what he perhaps attached most importance to, he had won the heart of Queen Victoria. I do not believe for a moment that this was of any political significance, but it is undoubtedly true that Queen Victoria rated Disraeli above her other prime ministers, and that Disraeli paid her with an exaggerated affection and respect. As he said, when you come to royalty, you must lay on flattery with a trowel. It was not only with royalty that Disraeli did this. When he came to any political issue, he laid it on with a trowel, and he left, therefore, if not solid achievements, a glitter, a sparkle, a demonstration which keeps his name alive. And that's it.
That's it. I'm appalled, frankly appalled.
So Taylor managed to be even worse than the guy from last time.
Well, actually, I will give Taylor the benefit of the doubt. I mean, I prefer a socialist to a wet Tory any day, really. I mean, I prefer outward contempt for Disraeli as opposed to trying to obfuscate and vanillarize his legacy so that future conservatism, especially who was the politician? Sorry, the author of the last book. I forget his name.
Was it Robert Burke? Was it? Or
Something like that. I don't know. I mean, on the last point about Victoria, again, you know, it wasn't just a personal relationship with Victoria. It was very much the Conservatives trying to rejuvenate the monarchy at a time where republicanism was incredibly strong. And again, there is a whiff of the Jacobite about Disraeli in the sense that he does wed political power to the monarchy, but he also, because of the system, has to wed it to the working class constituency. And none of this is mentioned. It's quite incredible.
I think it's worth showing who's responsible for let's have a look at AJB Taylor. Dishonest chin, dishonest nose, dishonest deceitful eyes. I mean, there he is. Not his finest piece of work.
Well, it's interesting. I mean, I have various books by A.J.P. Taylor, especially books relating to Austria. He's a very unusual, unconventional historian. To try and give him some credit. On the one hand, he's a great apologist for, talk about Germany. He's a great apologist for the Hungarians and the Slavs and, the Beneš regime in Czechoslovakia. And so he has some sort of affinity for Austria. Yet on the other hand, he has this hatred of the Germans. And I think his vision of the Sonderweg, of course, is wedded to the Frankfurt School, the Fritz Fischer thesis and Marcusean attempts to try and destroy any sort of, integrity with German nationalism. But I think, I mentioned AJB Taylor also, wrote that book on Bismarck. I won't refer to that that biography, but I think I would like to, just to look at this from a bigger picture. I don't think Disraeli is unique. I mentioned the idea of wedding conservative policies to a larger electorate. Two major politicians during this time do the exact same thing. One is Napoleon III. Louis Napoleon, the nephew of the original Napoleon, came to power in France in 1848 through universal suffrage, which basically, voted in for a socially conservative, though economically left-wing regime, which was personified by Napoleon III, who then became a dictator. And again, you see this amelioration of the condition of the working class in France, especially through his Haussmann reforms and the clearing out of the Paris slums. You also have that with Bismarck. Bismarck comes into power, famously saying he will rule by iron and blood. He won't pay heed to liberal parliaments or liberal majorities. But how does he undermine them? How does he subvert them? He subverts them by promising universal suffrage, essentially to weaken the liberals' hold over the parliamentary system, and to create this direct link between the electorate and him personally and the king. But of course, with Disraeli, you talked about, from 1874 to 1876, the various workers' legislation, which, socialists laud as, some sort of great achievement, even though, again, it should be seen within a reactionary viewpoint, a Carlyle-esque viewpoint, as opposed to a socialist viewpoint. Bismarck is responsible for the first state-sanctioned pension regime. Really, he introduces the David Lloyd George reforms into 1880s Germany. And this is seen as an attempt to essentially pacify the Social Democratic Party, which is gaining serious momentum at this point. So this alliance between the aristocracy, the monarchy, the working classes, and basically handing out free stuff such as, state-sanctioned welfare and pensions. It doesn't take, it's not as extreme in Britain, of course. Britain is far more economically laissez-faire, and Germany is much more sort of economically protectionist, as we pointed out. But I think it's interesting that there are echoes of Disraelianism throughout Europe at the same time.
Yeah, I was a little bit shocked by how bad that was from Taylor. I mean, he didn't even try to be even slightly judicious or even-handed, or just basically kind of character assassination, really. As somebody's pointing out in chat, it's a little bit concerning because certainly when I was in school, was pushed really as one of the premier historians. He was always on reading lists.
Well, yeah, he's famously a popular historian, and like I say, I do have several of his books. I wouldn't write him off, but I would definitely acknowledge that when dealing with certain historians, one always has to deal with I hate using the word bias because it's such a midwit term, because all historians are biased. That should come as obvious. But I think with Taylor, he's wedded not necessarily to of course in the latter cases, a political agenda, but he's wedded to a narrative of history which has to denigrate Disraeli because of his fetishization of Sir Robert Peel and his later socialism. And I think, again, just comparing those two things, understanding those things, one can therefore understand his view on Disraeli, which really is the Gladstone view on Disraeli. As for other things, A.J.P. Taylor, of course, is most famous for his origins of the Second World War, which is, in many ways, is a very good book. There are some issues with it, but I wouldn't completely write off A.J.P. Taylor. Just with all historians, one has to contextualize them.
Yeah, I mean, that was his main, that was Peter Hitchens' main source for that book, The Phony Victory. He draws on A.J.P. Taylor's stuff on that, although his earlier book, which we mentioned, which I actually recommended to Sargon once, because Sargon wanted to get onto the German question. I was like, well, you should read Taylor because that's the most anti-German book ever written, as far as I'm concerned. He basically calls the Germans psychopaths in that book. He just says, there's nothing that basically they've got an extreme character, and all through history are kind of like the worst people ever in Europe, basically. Like when the Germans snap, they snap properly, and
I think the worst type of history for me is history which has a certain teleology to it. There's a certain end point in it. There's a certain inevitability in it. I mean, of course, I do sometimes admittedly indulge in that myself. I think the reason we, some of us on our side, indulge in that is because we are seeing, the end point really of liberal democracy as a tolerable political system. And so we're looking at these things such as Disraeli with the point of ultimately it's going to lead up here with this, I would say, continually watered down, diminished and corrupted political system. But in the case of A.J.P. Taylor, he uses it to justify that all German history was essentially leading up to National Socialism. And, I find that completely monstrous. And I hate to plug my own channel, but eventually I will get round to doing a long series of historical streams trying to really do a deep dive into German identity and just the incredibly rich variety in history there, and not just all equated with some sort of inevitable endpoint at National Socialism.
Was Gladstone a better prime minister, and why? Why not?
Well, I think this comes into the whole, liberal conservative thing, we're really arguing about. I mean, I think what I find interesting, I used to be, a libertarian until, becoming increasingly radicalized, but I went through a phase of being attracted to Disraeli, then being attracted to Gladstone, then being, re-ingratiated with Disraeli, albeit with a lot of question marks around it, as, I've tried to show. If you look at it from a purely economic view, Gladstone is clearly a great prime minister in terms of again, his alliance with laissez-faire economics. However, that again is an entirely materialistic viewpoint. And when it comes to the issues on which Bismarck was not a materialist, because he was an eminent classicist, an enthusiast of Homer, his religion, of course, was very much commented on, and his theology was central to his life. He kept changing. His policies were always changing, and like I said, they were couched in this sort of religious fanaticism where when he performed a U-turn, he was completely indomitable and would pursue a course which I would basically argue would contradict all of his previous statements. Like I said, he began Parliament advocating for the retention of slavery and for the retention of the Test Act. And by the end, he's basically, the traditional image of Gladstone, chopping down trees. We have that famous image of him when he's won the election in 1874 and becomes 1868 and becomes prime minister for the first time. He's in his back garden chopping down trees and says, my mission is to pacify Ireland. That's all I have with Gladstone. I have this possessed fanatic going around just hacking at the traditional structures of Britain without any consideration other than a temporary zeal brought on by again, I can't understand his psyche. That's why I'm much more sort of sympathetic towards Disraeli. But again, I've probably talked too much, so I'll give you the space.
Yeah, I mean, my sense on this is going to sound impossibly meta here, but I mean, obviously, at one point I would have said Gladstone, because Disraeli in many ways ushered in socialism. Could put it that, you could look to see it that way. But as I've read more, especially certain let's just say books that we can't really mention on this stream, one of the things they point out consistently is that one of the ways in which Western culture is subverted is the way in which the discourse is bifurcated. Does that make any sense?
Yeah.
Where always there's always this idea that there are two competing ideas, and so verbal dexterity and things like rhetoric and things like making arguments, right, become much more important.
Yeah.
And that point Taylor made about one of the only point he was willing to give Disraeli was that he basically made the two-party system. Okay. And my sense is that that idea that there are two sides, right, is the central strength of what we call the cathedral. It is because it creates all sorts of false dichotomies, and that in itself pushes forward certain things.
Yeah.
Okay. I mean, take this Meghan Markle thing this week. Are you for the Queen, or are you for it's a talking point? I mean, the real answer should be we don't care.
Right. That's my view as well. Yeah.
But in that way, where you're kind of picking between two choices, both are framed, and also both of those sides are open to being subverted, right? Think of the neocons in America and how non-conservative they are in many ways.
Yeah, yeah.
Right? Or think of the Tory party and what became of them, or what happened to them. So it's obviously, like it's a trap. It's a trap that the two-party system in itself locks you into, now we've got a problem, because how do we get rid of this? It's very strong. I mean, Taylor mentioned there's a set of people waiting and ready to come in, and it's like this is within because they're the same. They're the same people, right? Yeah. It's like, oh, Boris loses, Keir Starmer comes in. Well, Keir Starmer is Boris. Do you know what I mean? It's like they're just all the same people over and over again. There's no real change.
Just to, again, add context, I mean, one of the things I like about 19th century politics as opposed to 20th century politics, like I said, I think it's the friction between conservatism and libertarianism. And I do think, again, under a lesser ruler, I think Disraeli, had he not been there, the Conservatives simply did not have the talent. You know, Robert Cecil was shrewd, but he definitely wasn't an ideologue. The Conservatives would have essentially been perpetually the party of opposition or controlled opposition to what were essentially, again, you know, a Whig agenda. And I think what I love about Disraeli is the fact that he was able, again, to conceive history and conceive politics in a way that was radically anti the consensus, the Whig consensus he found himself in. And he was trying to restore a form of ancient Toryism in contrast to Whiggism. And if anything, you know, the bifurcation, he was actually making a difference. There was actually a substantial difference between the two parties when Disraeli and Gladstone were there. You know, either you're for the bourgeois electorate and you're for the, you know, the retrenchment, you know, good financial management and the moralizing foreign policy of Gladstone, even though it was incredibly unsuccessful. Or with Disraeli, you're for the amelioration of the condition of the working classes, you know, this idea of paternalistic, you know, noblesse oblige, although in a different setting. And, you know, an imperial vision, which the Liberals simply were not able to provide. And when they did provide it, it was seriously watered down, like Lord Rosebery. What we see later with the Conservative Party is the fact they do simply imitate the Labour Party. And this is, you know, I would say the eventual result of the, what was the word you used? The division into that word.
Bifurcation, yeah.
The bifurcation. Is it, and you could say it leads to this situation where, you know, especially when socialism and conservatism are against each other, because conservatives don't have a particular political philosophy. And when you do have the reaction against the left, it comes from Margaret Thatcher, who is ultimately, in some regards, you could say, more classically liberal than any of her Tory predecessors, rising rebellion and really establishing the old Gladstonian opposition to what had been, you know, economic orthodoxy, which had basically been accepted since the time of Stanley Baldwin and Ramsay MacDonald. So I think we see that eventually, though I don't think we see that then. And I think what's also important to understand is that the Liberals destroyed themselves as a political party was one of the greatest knock-on effects in terms of British political history. You know, 1910 is really, you know, one of the key turning points in British history, along with World War I, and the turning for the Liberal Party from classically liberal to radically liberal would therefore give rise to Labour, and I see that as fatal to this division of the two parties as being in any way productive.